Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kaligan here with a huge World War III update. We are in the throes of the not-so-ceased fire. Of course, the Memorandum of Understanding between the United States and Iran has been signed. Pezeshkian has signed it on one end. Donald Trump has signed it on the other end. But as we all, of course, predicted, Israel has insisted upon themselves and are bombing Lebanon, are increasing their ground presence in Lebanon and pushing deeper into southern Lebanon on the ground itself. So the negotiations that were scheduled for Geneva this weekend have been postponed. So while the Memorandum of Understanding still seems to be in effect, Iran is openly threatening to pull out of it. There have been plans proposed to hold the United States to account, to hold Israel to account. And again, if things don't stop in Lebanon, the Iranians claim they will both pull out of the Memorandum of Understanding and punish Israel. So we are standing on the precipice of this. We are wondering if there will be any negotiations in Geneva, in Switzerland. Steve Witkoff apparently is going to be heading there. J.D. Vance and Ghalibaf have openly said that they will not be going there. So that is the current state of affairs as Israel pushes into Ali Taber, bombs the Baalbek city in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, all over the place. Some of the most intense bombings since the beginning of the war. 47 people have been killed over the past 2 to 3 days. So that is the situation. America is withdrawing from its naval blockade of Iran. Iran is pumping ships out of the Strait of Hormuz, out of the Persian Gulf. They have been shipping out apparently billions and billions of dollars worth of oil just in the past few days. So we're going to be discussing all of that. Itamar Ben-Gvir, Israel Katz openly saying they will be continuing to occupy Lebanon indefinitely, that they will be killing Lebanese civilians in retaliation. So we're going to be reading all of the insane Talmudic quotes discussing everything going on the ground. Of course, Israel's insistence on violating these negotiations. And again, it seems that if there is a collapse, which is very, very likely, it will entirely be Israel's fault. And it will then be in the lap of Donald Trump and his cabinet whether or not they will leave Israel out to dry or, as usual, get dragged back in by the Jewish lobby to do their bidding. So we're going to be discussing all of this, the response from Hezbollah, their resistance, the situation in Syria, of course. Al-Jolani al-Shura was potentially recruited to move into Lebanon on behalf of the United States and Israel. He seems to be rejecting that proposal. Israel is now claiming, between Turkey as their next target, Syria, they will also be at war with Syria, which they're probably mad that Syria didn't go into Lebanon on their behalf. So we're going to be discussing all of that. The major Ukrainian drone strikes on the Moscow oil refineries, the largest strikes on Moscow in the history of the war in Ukraine so far. So we're going to be discussing all of that. The strikes on the Lavra in Kiev, who was behind it. We're going to be getting to the bottom of all of these things, discussing the prophecies of World War III, some new updates apparently about the Greek, Turkish, Russian prophetic conflict that we're going to be discussing, as well as some other church news. So before we dive into all of that analysis, Dmitry, how are you doing? It's good to be back to our regular schedule, pre-recorded World War Now episodes. I hope you enjoyed your time off, but World War III does not rest.
No, it certainly does not, and it's been an incredibly busy week, Conrad. Obviously, the Lebanon situation is probably the most concerning because for most people, those who have familiarized themselves with the very short, it's almost like a 2.5 page, officially a 3-page memorandum of understanding between the US and Iran, Lebanon is mentioned in the first paragraph, in fact, and Lebanon is exactly the theater which the never-ending, ferocious, ruthless Israeli war machine is perpetrating its will, specifically in southern Lebanon. It just continues to push and push. So I think that's the main concern for the Middle East. And yes, in terms of diplomatic sincerity, I think this is almost the first time that the US and Israel don't see eye to eye. But it's been an absolutely insane week, and obviously Eastern Europe is just as incredible in terms of the news coming out of there. So absolutely jam-packed.
No, 100%. And again, things are still happening in Gaza. Things are still happening in Syria. Israel continues their quest to achieve the Greater Israel Project, which Naim Qassem, openly called out and condemned in his recent speech. So we're going to be discussing all of that. But if you have not tuned in to this week's Ether Hour episode already with former defense minister of Lebanon, that's right, Yaqub Saraf has returned for the third time to discuss the Memorandum of Understanding, to discuss what's going on in Lebanon. He brings us some breaking scoops that nobody outside of the Lebanese political sphere would know. He talks about the likelihood of a new government being formed in Lebanon, how Nawaf Salam and Joseph Ayoun and their coalitions are sort of holding on by a thread at this point and continuing to lose respect among the Lebanese people. Because again, who is the ones that are holding Israel to account, who are the ones that are forcing them to come to the table with Hezbollah and at least tentatively agree to these ceasefires that, of course, are violated. But who are the ones holding their feet to the fire? It's Iran. The Joseph Ayoun U.S.-led negotiations in D.C., which are insisting on disarming Hezbollah, as Hezbollah is the only thing standing between Israel and Beirut itself. Yeah, that's not cutting it. People are realizing that, no, these people are genocidal maniacs trying to annex our territory, and anybody that's against those that are actually fighting them on the ground are probably also our enemies. So Yaqub Sarafi talks all about that. He talks all about, of course, the actual Strait of Hormuz situation, the Memorandum of Understanding itself, the Iranian thinking. Again, he talks about Hezbollah, their thinking as well, the political situation in Lebanon, Nabi Berri, the other coalitions in the parliament, and what we could expect to see in the future. And of course, he gets into the World War III prophecies. I ask him about Turkey, Israel, Russia, Greece, St. Paisios, and he knows all about this. He's actually going to be on Mount Athos next week, so he's deeply in prayer concerning all of these sorts of things. So check that out. It's going to be linked below. Ether Hour, worldwarnow.co, of course, is where you can find all of our Ether Hour episodes. Get behind the paywall to listen to the full discussion with former Lebanese Defense Minister Yaqub Saraf and get access to hundreds and hundreds of hours of Ether Hour content, including interviews with Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson, Father Peter Heers, former member of the European Parliament, Nick Griffin, our multi-part series about St. John Vatatsis with Gregory Heers, our multi-part series of which we should be recording part 3 very soon, about the life and truth about Rasputin with our good friend Alex at Rasputin Archive. So many other incredible episodes. So please head on over to worldwarnow.co, check the Ether Hour tab out, get behind the paywall, support the show. It's what keeps these weekly shows free. It's what keeps the lights on here at the proverbial World War Now bunker. But with all of that, I want to thank everyone for tuning in. Again, worldwarnow.co, best way to support the show. Subscribe on YouTube, like this episode, especially on Substack. If you're listening, hit that like button. We want to be hitting over 50 likes per episode. We know that not everyone even has a Substack account. So please download that Substack app. Or if you're listening on YouTube, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you find us, please give us a like and a share. It really helps us out. But that's enough shilling. I know I'm yapping too much, so we'll dive right into what you're here for, the World War III analysis. But here, this is according to the Cradle. It says the start of a 60-day period of technical negotiations between Iran and the U.S. in Geneva was postponed on June 19th following a brutal Israeli escalation against South and East Lebanon. And that is, of course, what we mentioned. It says the Swiss Foreign Ministry confirmed in a statement that the talks have been pushed, but no new date provided. U.S. President J.D. Vance canceled his flight to Switzerland. Tehran's delegation also did not depart for the talks. According to a diplomatic source cited by CNN, Tehran is demanding guarantees that Israeli attacks on Lebanon end before going ahead with talks. The Iranians have asked for guarantees that hostilities in Lebanon will end as outlined in the signed agreement. Mediators are currently working to resolve the issue, the source said, adding that talks have been temporarily postponed following the Israeli strikes in Lebanon. Again, they've been striking all over southern Lebanon and in the Bekaa Valley around Baalbek in northeast Lebanon. So sure, they're not striking Beirut and Dahieh and the Shia suburbs, but they're striking basically everywhere else in Lebanon. So it's a blatant violation of what was agreed to. Apparently, Israel even supposedly agreed to separate ceasefires on the ground, at least in certain areas with Hezbollah, that have since been entirely violated. So that is the actual state of the situation. So before we actually discuss the Memorandum of Understanding, which I have pulled up right here, I need to make that clear that this thing is already effectively failed. But this is on NPR. This is the full text of the deal. It goes on, it says the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States of America have jointly agreed in good faith on, I believe it was signed on June 17th, 2026, on the following, this is point 1, the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States of America and their allies in the current war, by signing this Memorandum of Understanding, declare the immediate and permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, including in Lebanon, and undertake from now on not to initiate any war or any military operation against each other, and to refrain from the threat or use of force against each other, and ensuring the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Lebanon. The final deal will confirm the permanent termination of the war on all fronts, including in Lebanon, and other provisions of this paragraph. So again, this is not an end to the war. This is not a comprehensive deal. This is just an understanding memorandum of the ceasefire, extending it up to 60 days to then facilitate something akin to real negotiations. So he goes on here. Point 2, the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States of America undertake to respect each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity and to refrain from interfering in each other's internal affairs. 3, the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States of America commit to negotiating and achieving the final deal in maximum 60 days, extendable with mutual consent. 4, immediately upon the signing of this Memorandum of Understanding, the United States of America will begin the removal of its naval blockade and any disturbances or impediments against the Islamic Republic of Iran, and will fully end the naval blockade within 30 days. During this period, the traffic of vessels will be in proportion to the numbers of pre-war traffic being restored by the Islamic Republic of Iran. The United States of America further undertakes to remove its forces from the proximity of the Islamic Republic of Iran within 30 days after the final deal. Point 5. Upon the signing of this MoU, the Islamic Republic of Iran will make arrangements using its best efforts for the safe passage of commercial vessels with no charge for 60 days only from the Persian Gulf to the Sea of Oman, and vice versa. The traffic of commercial vessels will immediately start, and considering the need for removing the technical and military obstacles and demining by the Islamic Republic of Iran will be instated within 30 days. The Islamic Republic of Iran will conduct dialogue with the Sultanate of Oman to define the future administration of maritime services in the Strait of Hormuz, in discussions with other Persian Gulf littoral states in line with applicable international law and the sovereign rights of the coastal states of the Strait of Hormuz. So they're basically admitting that, yes, Iran and Oman will be the ones that control the strait, and while they may not charge those tolls, it's clear the language is ambiguous enough to where they will enact Bosphorus and Dardanelles-like tolls as Turkey has for environmental purposes, tugboats, and other management purposes. It talks about the demining situation, and again, this is another source cites that the disruption in the Strait of Hormuz will continue until at least 80 mines that are currently blocking the main route are cleared, and only the IRGC are going to be able to clear those because they were the ones that laid them and know the locations. So moving on, it says point 6, the United States of America undertakes with regional partners to develop a definitive mutually agreed plan with at least $300 billion for the reconstruction and economic development of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The mechanism for the implementation of this plan will be finalized as part of a final deal within 60 days. All required licenses, waivers, and permissions needed for the relevant financial transactions will be granted by the USA. Point 7, the United States of America undertakes to terminate all types of sanctions against the Islamic Republic of Iran, including the United Nations Security Council resolutions, the IAEA Board of Governors resolutions, and all unilateral U.S. sanctions, primary and secondary, in an agreed-upon schedule as part of the final deal. The Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States of America acknowledge the critical importance of the sanctions termination issue above mentioned and express their intentions to immediately address these issues in the negotiations in order to achieve mutual agreement on them. Point 8, the Islamic Republic of Iran reaffirms that it shall not procure or develop nuclear weapons. The Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States of America have agreed to resolve the disposition of stockpiled enriched material pursuant to a mechanism that will be mutually agreed upon in accordance with the schedule mentioned in paragraph 7, with the minimum methodology to be blending on site under the supervision of the IAEA. The two parties also agreed to discuss the issue of enrichment and other mutually agreed upon matters relating to the Islamic Republic of Iran's nuclear needs based on a satisfactory framework being agreed upon in the final deal. The final deal will confirm the provisions of this paragraph. The Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States of America acknowledge the critical importance of the nuclear issues above mentioned and express their intentions to immediately address these issues in the negotiations in order to achieve mutual agreement on them. 9, the pending final deal. The Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States of America agree to maintain the status quo. The Islamic Republic of Iran will maintain the current status quo of its nuclear program, and the United States of America will not impose any new sanctions and will not deploy any additional forces in the region. 10, the United States of America undertakes that immediately upon the signing of this MoU and until the termination of sanctions, the U.S. Department of Treasury will issue waivers for the export of Iranian crude oil, petroleum products, and derivatives, and all associated services, including banking transactions, insurances, transportation, etc. 11, the United States of America undertakes to make fully available for use the frozen and restricted funds and assets of the Islamic Republic of Iran upon the implementation of this MoU. The United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran will mutually agree on the procedures related to the release of these funds during the negotiations. Such funds, whether retained in the original account or transferred, shall be made fully usable for payment to any ultimate beneficiary designated by the Central Bank of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The United States of America undertakes to issue all necessary licenses and authorizations accordingly. And then point 12, the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States of America agree that an executive mechanism will be established to monitor the successful implementation of this MoU and the future compliance of the final deal. Point 13 out of 14, after signing this MoU and subject to the beginning of the implementation of paragraphs 1, 4, 5, 10, and 11 of this MoU and the continuing implementation of these measures, the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States of America will start negotiations regarding the final deal exclusively on the other paragraphs. 14, the final point, the final deal will be endorsed by a binding United Nations Security Council resolution. So, again, remember all those points. I know it was a lot there, but Iran has effectively gotten everything: sanctions relief, control over the Strait of Hormuz, ceasefire in Lebanon, and a withdrawal of American forces from the region. The latest reports that we've heard is that America will be withdrawing entirely from the 5th Naval Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. They'll be apparently relocating that to Oman, entirely outside the Persian Gulf, not near the Strait of Hormuz itself. So big if true. I don't know what the state of the bases in Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, And Iraq will be, of course, most of the Iraqi ones were the largely destroyed ones. Maybe America will be pulling out of Erbil because Iran continues to strike Erbil. But again, Iran has achieved almost everything that they wish. The lack of nuclear weapons, their signing of the deal that says they will not acquire nuclear weapons, that is perfectly in line with the status quo. The fatwa that Khamenei and Khomeini, the first Ayatollah supreme leader, those fatwas were never officially rescinded by the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei. However, he has not reissued the fatwa. And as Yaqub Saraf, again, through our episode we just recorded, those fatwas are effectively null and void until the living supreme leader, Ayatollah, reissues them. They effectively expire with the death of the spiritual leader, I guess, that gave them. So that is the situation. But again, considering how much was given up by the U.S., how much Iran got in this Memorandum of Understanding, consider this. Only Pezeshkian signed it. Of course, Donald Trump signed it in the same room in Versailles where the Germans signed the Treaty of Versailles. So consider that. Consider where the symbolism there. But not only did Mojtaba Khamenei, the supreme leader, not sign this, Ghalibaf and Araghchi didn't even sign it. So they're clearly relegating the responsibility for this Memorandum of Understanding and its potential failure to Pezeshkian, the most moderate elected official. And again, this is from antiwar.com from Dave DeCamp. It says Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Mojtaba Khamenei said on Thursday that he approved the Memorandum of Understanding between the U.S. and Iran despite having a different view on the deal. Khamenei said the Iranian officials, including Masoud Pezeshkian, wanted to reach the deal out of sincere concern and goodwill, and said that it was brought about by the desperation of President Trump. I, as a matter of principle, held a different view, however, out of the commitment that the esteemed president, as the head of the Supreme National Security Council, gave to me on his own behalf and on behalf of the other members regarding the safeguarding of the rights of the Iranian nation and the resistance front, and his explicit acceptance of that responsibility, I granted my permission, Khamenei said in a written statement published in English on X. The Iranian leader said that Pezeshkian told him that if the American side seeks to make excessive demands, they will not submit to them, and added that in-person negotiations in the future will not mean acceptance of the enemy's position. Under the MoU, which was signed by Trump and Pezeshkian on Wednesday, negotiations on Iran's nuclear program and other issues are set to begin for at least 60 days, with the option to extend the negotiation period by mutual consent. The immediate effect of the MoU is that the U.S. will end the blockade on Iranian ports, and Iran will allow more traffic to transit the Strait of Hormuz. Both of those things have begun despite the Israeli violations, by the way. The MoU also calls for the immediate end to Israel's war in Lebanon, which could be a major stumbling block to implementing the deal. Blah, blah, blah. Iranian military has warned of harsh response if Israel continues its strikes and occupations. And of course, we also heard from Malek Shariati, a member of parliament in Tehran, claims that President Pezeshkian has prepared a 6-point plan to counter U.S. misconduct in case they don't abide by the MoU. The 6-point plan contains detailed preparations for specific Iranian countermeasures to any American violations. It has been sent to the Supreme Leader for approval. So we have a Memorandum of Understanding about the Memorandum of Understanding as far as within Iran. And of course, CENTCOM obviously announced that they have ended the Iranian blockade. So that is the current status of things. War in Lebanon continues. As of right now, things appear eerily quiet, but alas, the Israeli advances from today are still, I think, being waged out on the ground. So, Dmitry, I'd love your thoughts on the 14-point Memorandum of Understanding, on the Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei's perspective on it, Pezeshkian's perspective, how the signing went about the Strait of Hormuz, and how you feel Israel is already sabotaging this. I'd love your thoughts on all of it.
No, it's really curious how the signing essentially took place at around 4 p.m. local time in Paris, France, obviously in Versailles, just outside of the capital city. But it's curious that just around midnight and overnight, Israel conducted a serious amount of raids just as night fell over the south of Lebanon. And yes, they didn't necessarily strike Beirut this time around, but they did kill a significant amount of people. And at this point, it isn't even clear if these are Hezbollah operatives or civilians. Most likely a mixture of both, with the majority being in the civilian numbers, as evidence has been, obviously, of those attacks provided over the last few years. Israel does not mind, committing collateral damage onto the populations, which it seeks to essentially denounce as terroristic. In this particular case, 47 people have died just over the last 24 hours in Lebanon, and there are at least 90 people who are seriously injured. And given the overtaxing and the Lebanese medical system, the hospitals being essentially stretched thin, who knows, many of those 90 people may also perish thereafter. So, similar situation to when the Ukrainians bombed the Lugansk People's Republic campus school, and of course, there was children who died and perished over the next few days because, again, the local hospital just couldn't provide them enough care in the sufficient time because the bombing was so severe. And same thing here. So Israel basically went out of its way, just literally not even 10, 12 hours after the signing of the memorandum, and began committing raids against the one country which, again, Iran may well and truly stand up for, and of course postpone the Memorandum of Understanding until hostilities do cease. So Israel is knowingly and willingly going against President Donald J. Trump and his administration in trying to procure some sort of peaceful negotiations that will go forward between the two countries. And obviously, the Middle East will not be in a peaceful state until obviously the state of Israel is subdued in some way. But this is the first time, Conrad, I think we've ever seen the Trump administration like directly, in a way, meet some sort of opposition from what we would call the Jewish lobby in America. Specifically, AIPAC, for example, has already issued its displeasure. We've had groups such as the AJC, the ZOA, specifically the AJC, the American Jewish Committee. They responded very quickly to the Memorandum of Understanding. They published 7 or 8 reasons as to why they disagree with it. One of them was that they don't like that the U.S. is reducing their presence in the region, so they think this is a threat to Israeli security. They don't like any of the notations regarding Lebanon because they say Lebanon and Hezbollah specifically is a threat to Israeli security, and they don't think Lebanon should at all be included until Hezbollah is disarmed entirely, which, by the way, this agreement does not speak to Hezbollah disarming at all because, as we all understand, and including Trump understands, it's clear Hezbollah will not be disarming. Like, they could barely get Hamas to agree to signing themselves on for some sort of long-term disarming procedure, and even that hasn't even been fulfilled yet. So, and it's been over a year at this point. So, obviously, the AJC is opposed to the economic benefits to Iran. They're claiming the $300 billion, and also the fact that Iran can now obtain some sort of incremental revenue from the Straits of Hormuz that will somehow benefit the Iranian defense industry, which I think, truthfully, yes, there is a lot of infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt in Iran. The US and Israel have caused immense damage to the Iranian countryside, certain towns, cities, etc. Roads need to be fixed. That bridge next to Tehran needs to be rebuilt. But we just have to keep in mind, Iran does have a right to actually allocate some of those funds towards, I think, their defense industry, simply because their sovereignty has been breached repeatedly since 2025 for no fault of their own, simply by these premeditated strikes. Any country not allocating significantly more money into their military-industrial complex, into defending their own nation is, of course, we can just say almost sabotaging their own future. So I think it's somewhat Israel has these double standards. Like, if Israel was in Iran's place, they would absolutely allocate much more funds now that they've suffered immense damage in the war. And the other thing that Israel, the AJC specifically, seems to be very critical of is just the fact that there is certain lack of transparency on the nuclear issue. They still are pushing this idea that the nuclear threat towards Israel's existence is immense, and that Iran will still be able to somehow create nuclear weapons in the future, really at short notice. And this is quite bizarre. It's almost artificial. And if you recall, Conrad, even before Trump became president, it was like, I believe in late 2014, 2015, when the Obama deal with Iran was signed, the main issue that all these Jewish committees had specifically with Obama was over the nuclear, the loosening of the terms allowing Iran to essentially provide for itself for civilian needs. And specifically, that was the first time when I think the American Jewish lobby in general has gone out of its way to criticize an American president. So it seems that there's this real concern for their own survival. And I think they understand that if there is a country in the Middle East that isn't Pakistan necessarily, Pakistan, we can say, is on the outskirts of the Middle East, right? It's more of a Indian subcontinent nation. But specifically, if there is a nation in the Middle East which possesses nuclear weapons that can create a deterrence to Israeli aggression, that's what they fear. It's not necessarily, I think, a fear of survival. It's a fear of justice, a fear of reprisal, and a fear of actually being threatened or being punished for committing the crimes that they've, of course, gone out of their way to commit over the last 50 plus years, or even since the Nakba, we can say. So I think that's primarily what the concerns are from the Israelis. But it's just very telling, I think, the frustration of J.D. Vance personally, the fact that he's having to publicly cancel these trips to Switzerland, Geneva, the fact that Trump is getting to run around. Yeah, the symbolism is insanely bad. Obviously, Treaty of Versailles levels of referencing The dates are very interesting as well. So if the 30 and 60-day period has not commenced yet because of the aggression in Lebanon, if that period has not ticked over from the 18th of June, then we can probably assume that, the 60-day or the 30-day period will not be, obviously, will not coincide with, say, the martyrdom of Tsar Nicholas II and the Alapayevsk martyrs in the middle of July, and that 30-day period hasn't even started. And also, this means, Conrad, that if the 30-day period hasn't even commenced ticking off yet because of the aggression of Israel against Lebanon, then in fact the US Navy will remain in place, because that's one of the main considerations, as you just read out to us, was that the US Navy will leave the Middle East. I mean, those ships that were already patrolling in the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Arabia as per standard procedures will still be there. However, those are just one or two destroyers, maybe a few frigates. The aircraft carriers will be going home, including, obviously, I'm assuming the Charles de Gaulle will not be remaining behind, obviously, for no reason whatsoever. But as soon as the US Navy leaves, then again, Israel will be less inclined to again pursue aggression against Iran. There won't be any of these premeditated strikes against the Iranian People's Republic. And I just need to emphasize, so Israel, in a way, it's keeping the American Navy, a large portion of American sailors, in a position of combat readiness in the Sea of Arabia next to the Straits of Hormuz, which again allows for the situation to break out in flames at any point due to some sort of black swan event or provocation or who knows what. And I think it is really curious that they're probably going to be pushing this line of sustained aggression for quite some time more. And I think even though Trump has essentially rebuked Israel for their failures to actually stop the bloodshed in Lebanon and to stop this sort of unnecessary aggression in the south of the Litani River, I think until Trump openly comes out and condemns Israeli aggression, and he'll be the first president in basically a generation to do so, maybe, and maybe even longer, I think Israel will continue to strategically, for their own good, so to speak, they will continue to push this line of, well, we're going to continue aggressing against Lebanon so that the US will remain in the Persian Gulf for our own protection. This is an entirely selfish act by the Israelis, essentially keeping American troops in dangerous positions, including in Iraq as well, where they are always susceptible to strikes from, as you mentioned earlier, Conrad, the Iraqi militias, which again are very heightened, that we actually haven't seen them expressly even become involved in this war yet, and so there's a lot of potential for the situation to break down entirely, especially after this July period of the 4th of July celebrations, the FIFA World Cup finalizing, and all these other events that usually take place in the middle of the year. So extremely concerning. And I think Israel, especially the anti-Trumpian sentiments, they they kind of smell as if there's a false flag coming up, right? So the situation needs to be ignited again. And that's the inkling I'm getting from all this really bad anti-American rhetoric coming out from the Israeli hawkish right wing. Well, I don't even want to call it right wing, but just the Zionist wing.
No, it's true. The Jews really went mask off. I mean, a lot of the smarter, more intelligent Jews, both in Israel and America, are like, I know this is not going to be popular, but we really shouldn't be saying we want Trump and Americans to die because they've agreed to this deal. Because that's like, Trump went from immediately having like a 65% approval in Israel to having only 30% approval. We're seeing all this craziness. I mean, we remember, Mark Levin, Miriam Adelson, all these crazy people have talked about. Who was it? Roseanne Barr openly talking about how, if America doesn't support Israel, then America will fall and deserves to be destroyed. So that's the rhetoric that we are seeing in the midst of all of this. And again, who came out and really had a mask off moment? You had both the defense minister of Israel and the minister of national security came out openly. And again, I think it's a debate, and maybe the audience can answer this question in the comments. We had two very Jewish statements, one from the Israeli media from Channel 12 in response to the Lebanon items in the Memorandum of Understanding, which say a ceasefire does not mean ceasing fire. It means not escalating the attacks. So again, insane levels of Talmudism on display here, of Talmudry, but in an effort to make sure that he wasn't out of the spotlight, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister of Israel, one of the key cabinet members whose party coalition keeps Netanyahu's Likud coalition in power, he said, "For every tear of an Israeli mother, 1,000 Lebanese mothers must weep. All of Lebanon must burn. With all due respect to the Americans, Israel must make it clear to the entire world that the blood of our sons and the security of our citizens are not forfeit. All of Lebanon must burn. Our supreme duty is to protect the citizens of Israel and the soldiers of the IDF, and this commitment takes precedence over every other consideration. I told the Prime Minister, even in our private meetings, for every tear of an Israeli mother, 1,000 Lebanese mothers must weep. enough with the ping pong in the Middle East. You don't win with measured responses and restraint. You need to go berserk to obliterate, to crush the terror. And of course, this post violated X rules and has been limited. So there's that, but it has not been removed for public concerns. And of course, the IDF saw this, and of course, they were running with it. Itamar Ben-Gvir does speak for the IDF. Since this, 47 have been killed in Lebanon and 93 have been wounded just in the past, was it 2 to 3 days? So that, and since the Memorandum of Understanding was signed. So it's true, the Israelis seem to be correct that if that's a ceasefire, then no, it does not mean ceasing fire. And Trump is going to need to start to hold them accountable if they don't want Iran to strike them again. But unfortunately, Netanyahu may have to walk a fine line because he's the one that has to talk to Trump on the phone. But the actual defense minister, Israel Katz, who has even more power than Ben-Gvir, he openly says, no one can tell us what to do, as the U.S., of course, is criticizing the Israeli lack of discretion and lack of ceasefire in Lebanon. Not only are they not ceasing fire, they aren't just striking across all of Lebanon using these airstrikes they were supposed to not do. They're advancing on the ground. They hadn't done that even in the past few weeks. So it was crazy. This article from AA says, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz said late Thursday that Israel would respond immediately and with force if Iran attacks, saying that no one can tell us what to do, according to Israeli media. If Iran attacks us, we will act immediately and respond with force. No one can tell us what to do, and we have proven that, Katz said in an interview with Israeli Channel 14. All the capabilities exist and are being built, Katz added, saying Israel could respond immediately or act later. We never asked the U.S. to fight with us against Hezbollah in Lebanon, against jihadist elements in Syria, or against Hamas in Gaza, Katz claimed. We do that alone. We expected and still expect that the U.S. will back our right and give us a diplomatic umbrella, not a military one, to act against all these enemies, he added. In Lebanon, in Syria, and in Gaza, we will not move from the security zones. Not in Syria, not in Gaza, and not in Lebanon. We will not leave there under any circumstances. The statement came days after the U.S. and Iran signed a memorandum of understanding to end fighting on all fronts, including Lebanon. Israeli officials criticized the decision and vowed not to follow the provisions of the agreement, drawing a strong response from U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance. So we're going to get into that in a second. But between Ben-Gvir, Ben-Gvir, Israel Katz, and the heads of the IDF themselves, who again are continuing to advance within Lebanon, it's clear that the Washington Post report earlier this week was correct. That said that U.S. intelligence warns Israel is likely to undermine Iran peace deal. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu faces pressure to continue a military campaign in Lebanon, current and former U.S. officials said. U.S. intelligence agencies have warned the Trump administration that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is likely to take steps that will undermine President Donald Trump's efforts to reach a lasting peace deal with Iran, as the Israeli premier faces intense political pressure to continue waging his country's war in Lebanon, current and former U.S. officials said. Israel appears intent on maintaining military operations against Iran's proxy Hezbollah in Lebanon, an aim that would flout a core element of the fledgling agreement that calls for an end hostilities in that country, according to intelligence reports. This was obviously, I think, issued right before the memorandum was actually signed. The new U.S. intelligence report concludes that in the face of national elections this fall, Netanyahu's political survival is linked to showing his domestic audience that he will not withdraw troops from Lebanon, and that he is intent on escalating the fighting with Hezbollah, said one U.S. official familiar with the report. The official, like others interviewed, spoke on the condition of anonymity. The U.S. intelligence report also described Israel's frustration with the terms of the Trump peace memorandum, which undermine its broader objective of maintaining maximum pressure on Tehran, according to a current and former official. The report reflected that any suspension of hostilities or withdrawal from Lebanon will be seen in Israel as a defeat for Netanyahu, said the current official. And Netanyahu, of course, on Thursday reaffirmed this position himself. He said that Israel won't withdraw from southern Lebanon and end its war in the country, despite the U.S. Memorandum of Understanding that calls for an end to the conflict. We will restore security and prosperity to northern towns, Netanyahu said. That requires maintaining the security zone in southern Lebanon. It requires that we not leave there as long as Israel's security needs require it. And remember, if you listen to our episode with Yaqub Saraf, he talks about there's about 8 to 9 miles between the Israeli border and north into the Lebanon border that has just been completely turned into Gaza. So dozens of towns, I think 40 plus towns, Shia, Sunni, Christian, Orthodox, Maronite, have been completely destroyed, leveled to the ground, Gaza style. So keep all that in mind when they say, quote unquote, security zone. The Israeli military on Thursday also made it clear it was not withdrawing from Lebanon and published a new map showing an expanded occupation zone. The IDF is deployed in the security zone, 10 kilometers inside Lebanese territory due to operational requirements, the IDF said in a post on X that showed the map. IDF soldiers will continue to remove threats and strengthen the defense of Israel's northern residents. An Israeli official told Reuters that Israel was holding stubborn negotiations with the Trump administration on maintaining its occupation of Lebanon, but so far there's no sign that President Trump is willing to leverage U.S. military aid to enter the war. Israel Hayom reported that Netanyahu is bracing for pressure from President Trump over the war in Lebanon, whether there's currently no U.S. demand for the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the country. No U.S. demand, as if the Memorandum of Understanding just doesn't exist. Iranian officials have maintained that Israel must end the war and withdraw from Lebanon as part of its deal with the U.S., and the Iranian military has warned of a harsh response if Israel continues its attacks. Israeli strikes in Lebanon haven't stopped, and at least 3 people were killed on Thursday. And as far as the actual on-the-ground fighting situation goes, the advances, Israeli media, this is from the Islam Times, which is a very anti-Israel outlet. This says, Israeli media reported that occupation forces failed to occupy the Ali al-Taher Heights in the Nabatea district of South Lebanon. According to Israeli outlets, intense confrontations erupted as Israeli occupation forces units attempted to advance toward the area where Islamic resistance fighters of Hezbollah reportedly responded with ATGM strikes and drone attacks targeting tanks and troop movements, resulting in significant casualties among occupation forces. Meanwhile, further reports indicated that the wounded troops had been evacuated from Lebanese territory. In the same context, Israel Channel 14 added that the situation in Lebanon is very dangerous for our soldiers, noting that if there is no chance of success for our soldiers there, simply remove them. Similarly, other outlets stated that the security situation for IOF troops in Lebanon had been one of the most difficult in Israel's history, noting incidents of a tank driving on top of an IED, as well as heavy missile fire striking military vehicles. And that's true. I mean, in the past few days, several Israeli tanks have been completely destroyed. A staff sergeant was killed, along with other members of his crew. 3 or 4 people, I think, were killed in one either IED or drone strike, and their bodies have not been recovered, actually. And other drones, again, they were trying to take this town of Ali Taher. They are even refusing to advance fully into it. They are trying to encircle the town entirely. So they've occupied Kafar Tebnit and are advancing around the heights of Ali al-Taher into the town of Nabatea El Fouka. And people remember that fort, what is it, the Bedouin, I forget the name of the Beaufort Fort, the big Beaufort Castle Fort that the Israelis took. Apparently they're having trouble even holding on to that. So that is the security situation on the ground. Israel taking heavy casualties despite their desperate attempts to advance further and further. Because in their minds, if they advance further north, when there are negotiations, they'll be able to keep occupying more lands in the south. Because if you've listened to all of our episodes with Yaqub Saraf, you'd understand that Israel needs the land at least south of the Litani River for very basic reasons, even like water, as well as, of course, in their mind, achieving greater Israel and security against their enemies in the north, which, again, Lebanon, the most Christian state in all of the Middle East, and they're the ones that, obviously, it is the Shia that resist, but nonetheless, Lebanon is what is resisting. Of course, the article earlier mentioned J.D. Vance, who probably the most memorable quote from his remarks were that Israel can't kill your way out of all of their security problems. This is from Al Jazeera. It says United States President J.D. Vance has been defending the Memorandum of Understanding to end the U.S.-Israeli war with Iran, responding to criticism of the deal from members of the opposing Democratic Party and Republicans alike. Speaking during an interview with the New York Times published on Thursday, the day after U.S. President Trump and President Pezeshkian of Iran inked the MoU, Vance reserved some of his harshest criticism for Israel, whose leaders have continually pushed Washington to continue the war. Vance pointed to criticism of the deal from Israeli officials, including far-right ministers Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. This is what Vance said. He said, and I guess my response to them would be, what is your exact proposal? You're a country of 9 million people. You can't just kill your way out of solving every single national security problem you have. He called on Israel to let negotiations play out and to give a little bit of credit to the United States of America, which I think has been an incredible partner for the Israeli government for a long time. His statement was the latest instance of the Trump administration taking an atypically harsh approach, at least rhetorically, towards Israel, whose ongoing occupation of and military operations in southern Lebanon have repeatedly threatened to derail a more lasting agreement to end the war with Iran. In recent days, Trump has criticized Israel's rules of engagement, which war monitors have long said lead to high civilian casualties, while calling for restraint in its war with Hezbollah. Too many people have been killed, Trump said from the G7 summit in France. You don't have to knock down an apartment house every time you're looking for somebody, because there are a lot of people in those apartment houses. So obviously Trump and Vance have been criticizing Israel. Later in a statement, Trump also talked about how, we have to let Iran have missiles. Everybody else in the region has missiles. We can't say that Iran can't even enrich certain levels of uranium because Saudi Arabia and other powers in the region, Turkey, are all about to have major civilian nuclear energy. So Trump is just openly conceding, like, yeah, we got to let him enrich a little bit of uranium. And he's saying, I respect Mojtaba Khamenei, or, I killed the first Ayatollah and I regrettably injured the new Ayatollah, but he's a good man. And he's claiming they're less radicalized when they're obviously not less radicalized. Mojtaba Khamenei, again, has not issued a fatwa on nuclear weapons. He has not even issued his direct support for the Memorandum of Understanding. Obviously, he blessed Pezeshkian to move forward with it, but he himself clearly is not only prepared to go to war again with America and Israel, it seems to be the option that he actually prefers. So Trump is coping. However, I do hope that the goodwill that the Iranians are extending right now, perhaps not going to war again and striking Israel despite these major violations, killing 47 people, again, many civilians. Maybe again, if Israel continues to violate, finally America will step up and do something like put an embargo on Israel, blockade Israel. Of course, J.D. Vance and others and White House officials have already thrown a wet blanket on that, said none of that stuff is in consideration. But if Israel strikes Beirut, if Israel continues to advance on the ground, or if Israel does something else crazy and provokes Iran to pull out of the Memorandum of Understanding, anything short of, I think, a full diplomatic reshuffle of our relationship with Israel, including potential sanctions, arms embargoes, and yes, potentially even the threat of a maybe international coalition to restrain Israel in places like Lebanon and Gaza. Anything short of that, I think, would be just more evidence that, again, anyone listening to our show doesn't need, but more and more evidence to even the most bootlicking of regime supporters that fundamentally this country is run by Jewry.
Certainly so. And even I would just add Trump's comments just in relation to the civilian casualties in Lebanon. I mean, they're very restrained comparatively even to and look, Russia doesn't have the most anti-Israeli politicians in power. Certainly not. We've known these positions. Russia's been, for whatever reason, the Russian elites have been very cautious in how they've criticized the Israelis and their conduct. But even they have criticized Israel for a lot longer and a lot more consistently than Trump has. It's only now that obviously the media is more or less turning, especially left-wing media is turning on Israel, essentially not because of the Lebanon issue, but also because Lebanon in and of itself is simply a country which has a large diaspora overseas. So there's a lot more voices speaking out in favor of Lebanon abroad than there is even for Palestine, I would add. And it's quite clear that Trump is aware of the media hype and he's just trying to sort of play up to it. But I found very curious, Conrad, recently, obviously, the G7 took place and Trump's comments on the Syrian issue and Syria, how it plays into this triangle, Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. Trump's perspective on the potential for al-Shara, al-Jilani to become involved in sort of curtailing and curbing the Shia Hezbollah aggression against Israel has been very curious because we spoke about this, like the suspicion that, well, since 2024 at the very least, that this HTS-led government in Syria, out of Damascus, the people who took power in December of 2024, are inherently anti-Shia. They hate Hezbollah and they fought against Hezbollah and the Hezbollah allies of Bashar al-Assad and the allies of the Russians, frankly, because the Russians and Hezbollah fought side by side against both ISIS and the so-called Syrian moderate rebels and the HTS out of Idlib consistently for close to a decade before 2024. So keep in mind, al-Shara al-Jilani, the president of Syria, he hates Hezbollah. And Trump actually for the first time verbally basically confirmed what we've been saying here on the show for over the last 3 years in analyzing the Syrian situation and how it's basically deteriorated. And he says, obviously, that potentially if he was to ask Shara, he says Shara might be willing to take on the Shia armed group in Lebanon by essentially invading Lebanon and being used as a sort of like a Sunni Muslim peacekeeping force to keep Hezbollah, I suppose, occupied and to assist the Israelis. In fact, Trump was almost, I think, alluding to the fact that the Sunni Muslim radicals from Damascus could actually do a better job than the Israelis. And potentially they could. Frankly, they've been fighting a war of aggression against the Shia Muslims, and you can say almost maybe the troops on the ground out of the Syria, the rabble, the so-called mercenaries, the cutthroat Wahhabis and Salafis are much more radical than even some of the newly conscripted Israelis and some of the, let's just say, not to quote Rabbi Mizrahi, but some of the, alphabet community, LGBTQI mobilized the Israeli IDF forces. Like, if you really think about it, Israel certainly has elite commando units who are definitely much more stronger equipped, but we can't sort of ignore the fact that these Sunni Muslim radicals from Syria have been fighting on the ground. They're experts at using weaponry. We've seen some of their actions against the Kurds, and they are incredibly savage. You can almost use them as a mercenary force to fight Hezbollah if you're taking the perspective of Zog. And that, I think, has been on the cards from the very start. But the most curious thing is here, Conrad, is that Israel would then, coincidentally would need to perhaps stop its push into Quneitra province and towards Damascus, expanding that Golan Heights Golan Heights area, towards Mount Hermon, and of course all that symbolic territory where essentially that triangle of Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Golan Heights, and Syria, where all these three countries meet. Israel is trying to secure this incredible, not even a buffer zone at this point, but essentially what we would call a defensible bridgehead beyond even the Golan Heights, maybe even onto Mount Hermon and so forth. And that's why they're even bringing the radical Zionist settlers to make sure some of these villages and territories remain Israeli, and that the Israelis actually begin to see these territories as something that's worth defending, something you can mobilize the Israeli population in the future later on to defend if things really get out of hand. So it is really just curious that Trump really had this proposition, but al-Shura did deny it on actually in following days. Al-Shura stated that all of these claims that Syria and his government will become involved in the Lebanon issue are completely unfounded. Again, we cannot trust someone who, this is obviously, I don't even want to use the word taqiyya here, but these people are professional liars. They are suicide bombers. They actually, by suicide bombers, I mean they've actually conducted themselves in ways of wartime deception in the past. These are expert covert operatives. They are, terrorists by trade. You cannot trust what al-Shura al-Jilani says. So even though he's denied Trump's words that Syria will become involved, all he needs really, Conrad, if we think about it, is a tug of the Turkish and the American leash. And even if Israel says, look, we'll stop bombing Damascus and some of those areas in the southwest provinces of Syria if you send 10,000, 20,000 fighters into southern Lebanon, south of the Litani River, to assist us in clearing out Hezbollah. I think something like that could be on the cards. And frankly, yes, Israel, all it really needs to do is not necessarily fight side by side with the jihadis, but it just needs to stand back and not bomb the jihadis. And I think they will actually play up to this idiotic plan. And it's completely insane when you consider the fact that the Palestinian resistance groups, Hamas even, and other groups have spoken out in favor of this HTS government, which will now be fighting potentially in the near future side by side with the Israeli Zionist forces, the IDF, who've actually killed more Sunni Muslims than they have killed Shia. And yes, this just shows you how brain dead radical Islam really is, and what kind of a tool of Zog and world globalism it really has become. It's like literally a weaponized disease. It's similar to the biolabs being used in Ukraine. In fact, it's much more effective. It's almost like a militarized ideology, like in COVID form that just spreads around and causes havoc and distractions away from what really matters, which is, again, is the spiritual life. But spiritual life is disrupted by the fact that people are chopping off heads and bombing locations all around this Middle Eastern area, perpetrated by Israelis aggression against the innocent sovereign nations like Syria. So it's just completely insane, the fact that Trump even contemplated something as crazy as this, Conrad. But it does also show Trump has, for the first time, confirmed for all of us who suspected who stands behind this new head-chopping Al-Qaeda government over whose persona he sprayed cologne in years prior. Trump confirmed that it was him and Erdogan. So it was a NATO project. Yeah.
No, 100%. Trump gave that speech at the G7 talking openly about how him and Erdogan installed al-Jilani, al-Shura, and why might al-Jilani have rejected Trump's proposal? Well, honestly, Erdogan and the leader of Qatar, who were the other major people in charge of putting him in, probably, at least right now, didn't want him to go into Lebanon. I mean, Turkey right now and Israel are not necessarily on good terms. And obviously, we've talked about the prophetic realities of how Israel and Greece's alliance will play into the prophecies with a future, potential attack by Israel on Turkey, and how, again, this could draw in Russia and everybody else like the prophecies talk about. But, we also, America is going to have to start to turn against Turkey. And Trump loves Erdogan, but as Metropolitan Theophitos talked about in the remarks that we've read so many times, Trump has puffed Erdogan up, sort of encouraged him to stretch himself into these other peripheral regions of the former Ottoman Empire. And now I'm sure behind the scenes there's a rift. I don't think Erdogan wants Syria to move into Lebanon on behalf of Israel, but that's definitely what Trump wants to do. So it might not be public yet, but perhaps behind the scenes, the Turkey-American interests are finally starting to really collide to where Israel may be allowed to move against Turkey more laterally. Erdogan may be moved against politically, and his replacements, whether it be Ekrem İmamoğlu or Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, now restored to power in the opposition. That is a very potent reality we're going to have to look at. But in his recent speech on June 19th, Naim Qassem, Secretary General of Hezbollah, successor of Hassan Nasrallah, he talks about the Syria situation. I'm going to read the highlights from his speech, just from the cradle here. These are excerpts. He says, "We have adhered to the TAIF agreement and the Constitution, kept political disputes within the framework of national unity, and remain committed to liberating Lebanese territory, directing our weapons against the enemy." That is very true. Any of these, Lebanese forces, anti-resistance groups, and people that are claiming that Hezbollah, has contributed to the disunity of Lebanon is ridiculous. They've almost exclusively fought against Israel with their weapons, and Israel has done more killing of the actual Lebanese army in the past few months than Hezbollah has by far. He goes on, he says, "We confront all forms of political, cultural, educational, and moral subordination. When the enemy confronts us with weapons, we respond with weapons. Be confident that victory in the sense that leads to the expulsion of the Israelis from our land will be achieved. The project to end Hezbollah and consolidate the occupation has failed. They tried to pressure Syria to intervene from the east to form a pincer with Israel from the north, but thank God the Syrian regime did not respond. We were created free and chose to reject injustice, slavery, occupation, guardianship, and externally imposed projects. If we are capable of victory, why should we surrender? The enemy has not defeated our conviction, steadfastness, and continuity. We are present in the arena and endure all difficulties and sanctions. The plan being implemented against us today aims to end the resistance and its people and completely eradicate its presence from Lebanon. The enemy in America backed out of the 27th of November agreement after the fall of Syria because they considered that the balance of power had changed. I tell you, we are going through the most dangerous phase in Lebanon, the most dangerous conspiracy project, and the most dangerous thing that our country's future could face. They wanted to close the air, sea, and land crossings to prevent the arrival of weapons technologies and everything that could strengthen the resistance. The plan aimed to prevent reconstruction so that people would remain displaced and the environment of the resistance would turn against the resistance itself. They imposed a financial blockade to prevent us from dealing with the situation and from being able to recover. So, strong statement of resistance. And again, I talked about the Al-Tafir front. It says Hezbollah on Thursday said it thwarted Israeli attempts over the past 4 days to advance toward the southern Lebanese town of Kafar Ebnet and Ali al-Taher, claiming to have inflicted casualties and material losses on the attacking forces. The statement marks the group's first military announcement in nearly 48 hours, according to an Anadolu correspondent. The pace of Israeli attacks on Lebanon has generally slowed over the past 3 days, coinciding with the U.S. agreement intended to pave the way for ending the war launched by Washington and Tel Aviv against Tehran on February 28th. Hezbollah said the Israeli army had been attempting for 4 days to advance toward Kafar Ebnet and Ali al-Taher along multiple routes, backed by heavy artillery fire and aerial surveillance carried out by reconnaissance aircraft. It said its fighters confronted all of those attempts by targeting Israeli troop movements with rockets, drones, and loitering munitions, inflicting losses among officers, soldiers, and military vehicles, forcing the troops to withdraw and use helicopters under cover of smoke and artillery fire to evacuate their casualties. According to the statement, Hezbollah fighters detected at 8 p.m. local time on Wednesday an Israeli infantry force infiltrating the northeastern outskirts of Kafar Ebnet and targeted with a swarm of drones and Ababil loitering munitions, leaving its members dead or wounded. It goes on for some more descriptions of the battles there. But again, the claims are about 4,000 to 5,000 Hezbollah militants have been killed potentially since the start of the war. But again, that sounds like a lot compared to perhaps just the several hundred IDF or 1,000 or so troops have been potentially killed. But remember, Hezbollah has 50,000 plus soldiers, and they are all, again, view all of this as martyrdom. So the idea that a few thousand dead would somehow be a huge victory for Israel is not the case. And this is from Middle East Eye. The headline here, Israel will be at war with Syria sooner or later. This is from the Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Amishai Shikli, who outlined a radical Sunni axis of evil made up of Pakistan, Turkey, and Qatar. So, of course, we've got the Shia axis of evil with Iran, Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and, of course, a few other different factions, even in Palestine. But now we also have the Sunni axis of resistance, Pakistan, Qatar, and Turkey. This article says an Israeli minister from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party said this week that Israel will be at war with Syria sooner or later. The remarks came in a series of radio interviews given by Minister of Diaspora Affairs Amishai Shikli on Wednesday and Thursday, in which he outlined what he dubbed a radical Sunni axis of evil. There is no way that a jihadist regime rooted in ISIS and al-Qaeda, whose aspiration is the unification of Jerusalem, can live in peace alongside the state of Israel, the far-right minister said, referring to Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara's government. Speaking to Israel's Army Radio on Thursday, Shikli outlined what he considers to be a new anti-Israel alliance made up of Pakistan, Turkey, and Qatar, which he said worried him far more than Iran and its ceasefire deal with the U.S. While the Likud minister acknowledged that Iran had scored some major achievements with the U.S. agreement, he said that what is far more troubling is the new axis emerging in the Middle East. The Israeli minister suggested that Pakistan and Turkey were part of this axis after playing a major role in negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. In another interview on Thursday with Kol Barama Radio, Shikli explained his view of Qatar's role in his emerging axis, saying that the Gulf country is the PR arm of the jihadists. So, as we've predicted, more and more voices in Israel calling for aggression against Turkey, against even Pakistan and Qatar. So that is very, very interesting, but not surprising to say the least. But in that same front that Hezbollah was fighting in the Ali al-Tahrir area, Hebrew media is now claiming without any evidence that Iranian field commanders are directively involved in the defense of the town. So I guess when you start to lose and you can't immediately take the town, which Israel has failed to do many times in Lebanon, they have to claim, oh, they must have the ghost of Soleimani must be there, guard, leading the Hezbollah forces. But again, the Hezbollah forces, they're going to fight to the death in the center of these towns. So that's the situation. In Syria, again, you mentioned the advances into the Quneitra province, Dmitry. We got an update from Levant 24. The document reported Israeli airstrikes, ground incursions, raids, detentions, checkpoints, and property destruction across Syria. They control a very large corridor of land, the entire border of the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights, at least several kilometers in all directions, and along the border with Lebanon even, are controlled by Israel, including, again, Mount Hermon, many of these other, which is on the Lebanon border, which, again, they probably want to launch an operation against Hezbollah from there in conjunction with Syria. But if they're not going to do that, then Syria, of course, is an enemy, and they're going to continue to protect and arm the Druze population that are their allies there, that are apparently asking for, annexation into Israel, or at least that's what Israeli media would have you believe. But before I get your thoughts on that, Dmitry, of course, we're talking all about the Memorandum of Understanding. Many Jews are angry about it. Some Jews, again, would rather refocus to Turkey, I guess, according to this Likudnik. But one obstacle to the Memorandum of Understanding that people might not have discussed is potentially France. And it says here, France says UN sanctions on Iran cannot be lifted without its approval. It says France is seeking involvement in negotiations over Iran's nuclear program and will not support the removal of UN sanctions unless it is satisfied with the provisions of a final agreement, the country's foreign minister said on Friday. Jean-Noel Barrot, whose nation holds veto power as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, told France Info that lasting regional stability would require any U.S.-Iran discussions to address not only Tehran's nuclear activities, but also its ballistic missile program and backing of proxy groups. The return for major concessions that will be asked of Iran is the lifting of sanctions that were taken at the United Nations, he said. France is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, so as was the case 10 years ago, France will have to give its approval for the sanctions to be lifted. Barrot stressed that France's consent would be necessary for any UN sanctions relief, just as it was during negotiations a decade ago, given its status as a permanent Security Council member. I don't know why suddenly France is coming in and demanding Israeli-level demands like ballistic missile pullbacks and proxy group discussions, which, again, we're just getting to nuclear right now. The Iranians are barely allowing that. These things about ballistic missiles and proxies are not allowed at all. Trump already conceded publicly that they're allowed to have their ballistic missile programs. So interesting that France, who historically had been a closer ally of Iran than the United States, are suddenly coming out with some very Jewish nonsense. Of course, the right wing in France is completely compromised by Jewry, so perhaps Macron is hoping to shore up his coalition and their goodwill with the Jews even more so that they don't replace him with Bardella and these other people from National Rally. So I'd love your thoughts on that, Dmitry, as well as, of course, the on-the-ground situation in Lebanon and Ali al-Tahrir in the Beaufort Castle, all of these areas, as well as the situation in Syria, as Israel seems to want to fight Turkey in Syria, in Turkey, and elsewhere. A whole host of the eight-front war continues as Israel's Greater Israel Project is in full effect.
That's right. It's really curious, obviously, because the Iranian revolutionary regime that has now, of course, become the choice of government for the Iranian people and has been so for the last 60-odd years. For the last 40 or so years, when this regime came to power, it was with the assistance of France, specifically in French special forces. They are the ones who allowed Khomeini to actually live in France. They gave him, it was an Air France plane that brought the Iranian revolutionaries into Iran to overthrow the Shah. And France at the time obviously was a NATO country, and all of that is thrown into the mix. And yes, it was perhaps a long-term project against American and British petroleum and some sort of British Jewish influences over the petrol industry of Persia and Iran. But in the long term, it really hasn't eventuated. French presence in Iranian politics is a very minor issue, so I'm not sure if that gamble really played out in the long term. But yes, France historically has been extremely friendly with Iran as opposed to the UK and even the USSR and and the United States. So that's really interesting that now, of course, France wants to have a say. Again, yeah, you're correct, Conrad. It may be an internal play for influence from Macron and his cabinet, specifically the foreign minister, who they want to retain some sort of influence over the deal making. And of course, this is the Charles de Gaulle and the French destroyers. Specifically, the main forces of the French Navy are located within the waters, within naval reach of Iran at the moment, and that I think is also a consideration. But eventually, just as with most decisions concerning Ukraine, Trump will essentially apply the needed pressure, I think, onto the French government, and they will, I think, give the appropriate concessions. But absolutely, the French right wing, the left wing, they're incredibly compromised. As mentioned by Gabriel de Rochen in previous interviews, the French, to become influential within French politics, you need to become a Freemason. That's not an example from the 19th or the 18th century. That's literally the modern reality. That entire country is probably the most Masonized nation on earth, and that is a huge compromising factor. And of course, the decision-making of the hawks or doves, the left wing or the right wing alike. But just in relation to the things Israel has been saying about Syria, Conrad, I think Israel Katz, the defense minister of Israel, the things he's been saying on public television recently, incredibly concerning, because he's been using the excuse we've been mentioning in relation to Syria and the regime in Syria for a while. He's now saying that, look, there are basically jihadis who rule Syria, and that Israel needs to remain in Syria, remain in these provinces beyond the Golan Heights, because Israel must protect itself from what we see in Syria, taking place in Syria. But mind you, Israel assisted in causing this state of disrepair, the state of mutiny within the very diverse Syrian population in the first place by bombing all of the Syrian military bases leading up to December 2024. It actually brought to power this particular Salafi Wahhabi regime in the first place by essentially allying itself, maybe temporarily so, with Turkey to oust Bashar al-Assad's family from power. And look, at this point, maybe they're unhappy as to exactly who has the dominant say over the HTS regime in Damascus. Maybe they're not happy that it's Erdogan who has more a presence over there than it is Netanyahu in Tel Aviv. But at the end of the day, I think they were always willing to use the excuse of bringing jihadis into power so that they later can themselves expand into, obviously, most likely the eventual Greater Israel project, expand into Syrian lands under the pretext that we are simply creating a buffer zone, we're conducting anti-terrorist operations, similar to what they did in Gaza, etc. So this is almost an excuse for them. And Israel Katz, we saw him this week saying that exact same thing, essentially claiming that Syria is untrustworthy, Syria is a dangerous place for Israelis. Israel must remain within Syria, just as they must remain south of the Litani River to essentially protect themselves. That this is the pretext, this is the excuse. And I mean, the primary point of messaging here is to the actual native Israeli population and to the Jewish diaspora around the world. Even those may be faltering on the sort of edge of common sense, Conrad. They're telling the Talmudic population around the world, left-wing Jews, even non-religious Jews, that you must continue accepting Israel's sort of war of aggression against these particular nations nearby, even if you maybe feel that is a bit, even left-wing Jews, you may feel that what's happening south of the Litani River is not appropriate, or what's happening in Syria is a little bit maybe hawkish. However, you must agree that this is for the greater good of the Jewish people, generally speaking, in order to prevent a future Holocaust or a future genocides. So they purposefully putting out these messages that what Israel is doing is primarily defensive. Now, we know that's untrue, and again, this rhetoric will continue to pour out as they've done with essentially Gaza and the so-called war against Hamas, which that was essentially all that entire genocide was started just because of what they perceived they saw on October 7th and thereafter. And of course, they haven't had a new October 7th since. I mean, some of the Hezbollah missiles and those isolated drones flying into Israeli territory, they're trying to portray that as a massive blow against Israel's sovereignty and the safekeeping of Israeli lives. But again, the damage that's caused is not even comparable to October 7th, really, if we look at it, even from a conservative perspective. So Israel hasn't had a second October 7th, and for them they need to incrementally, again, continue messaging the fact that Israel is a nation defending itself. And that's probably why you even see a lot of, let's just say, BRICS summit countries somewhat being a little bit defensive. Like, they're not necessarily even taking anti-Israeli positions. Some of them are neutral towards neutral negative. They're not necessarily very anti-Zionist at this point, and that's because Israel is doing something that all of them, especially countries like India and Russia, have this reasoning they've utilized in the past. That is, we're fighting against jihadi insurgents, we're fighting against Muslim radicals, and India has done similar things, and Russia has so as well in the Chechen, Dagestani insurgencies. And again, Israel knows exactly what they're doing. These are professional PR, foreign policy messaging tactics that we're seeing here. So there's a strategy behind the hawkishness. But every now and then, as we said early in the episode, Conrad, you do see a bit of that very ancient Baali and Molochian evil, sort of really ruthless and tenacious rhetoric come out from people like Ben-Gvir, and they expose the true sort of face of the beast, the true sort of demonic possession that's really standing behind these forces, and that's total enslavement, total genocide of everyone who they perceive to be as cattle. That is the goyim, as the rabbis say.
No, 100%. And you almost have to thank them for it. It's almost more dangerous if the opposition, the Yair Lapid, Naftali Bennett were in power, who they want the same things as Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and Netanyahu. They just want to do it with a kinder face, more in conjunction with the international Jewish community, so that it all goes along smoothly with, a more subtle New World Order type of plan. So at a certain level, you almost have to be grateful that they're just kind of coming out and saying it, and that we have these ghouls like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir empowered, because it's the only way that Netanyahu can stay in power. But as of right now, the latest developments from Axios, so keep it with a grain of salt, it's from Axios, but it says here, U.S. envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are traveling to Switzerland for potential nuclear talks with Iran. The discussions were originally scheduled to begin on Friday, but were postponed amid fighting between Israel and Hezbollah. A new date has not yet been confirmed. Qatari Prime Minister Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani, a key mediator in the negotiations, is also in Switzerland. So it sounds like we might be getting some discussions with Qatar and some of their favorite landowners, Witkoff and Kushner, but I don't know if the Iranians are going to be there. And I think the Iranians are pretty sick of talking to those two Hebes. So I think J.D. Vance and Ghalibaf, that might have gotten somewhere, but those guys aren't going to be there. So this is just going to be more sideshow nonsense from the real estate development Jews and their Qatari friends. But one thing that's interesting with Vance, and you mentioned the kind of disgusting nature of Ben-Gvir and his statements, Vance sort of had to come out and kind of do a pressure release valve and tell the American people, like, yes, we're aware of these disgusting Jewish statements and we're against them, but Vance is he's not losing rapport. Of course, obviously his camp, he's supported by Joe Lonsdale, Peter Thiel, and Joe Lonsdale this week, of course, was talking about how Jews need to be strong and crush their enemies, and he was doxing, that young kid, Austin Franco, who said he didn't want to work for Jews, and that now that kid's having his life ruined by the Department of Justice. So really crazy stuff. But, so J.D. Vance sort of was biting the hand that feeds him, coming out and criticizing the Jews like this. And Randy Fine came out and tweeted, anyone but J.D. Vance for 2028. So Marco Rubio is positioning himself very expertly. He's managed to both be less connected to the Iran war and the Iran deal and the negotiations than J.D. Vance, who again is now on the hook for being about to go to Switzerland and now having the negotiations canceled. And J.D. Vance is now on the hook for having criticized the Jews for something that they certainly don't want Goyim criticizing them for. So Marco Rubio is very much ascending as the likely successor to Donald Trump right now. J.D. Vance, who knows if he was the one floating the rumors or if other people were floating the rumors that he might not even pursue a 2028 presidential run. But between how he's been having to handle the war and how he's going to have to own it more than Rubio, it's clear that he is feeling the heat there. So that's the latest. But again, as far as the Jewish lobby, it's not just in America. It's not just in the White House and in the Pentagon. It's even in the Russian military industrial complex as well. We had some very interesting statements from our good friend, President of Belarus, Lukashenko, Bachka. He said, during the hostilities, everyone in the world understood that the war would end quickly with a victory for the Russians. The Russians were in Kiev, but then politicians asked Putin to withdraw troops from Kiev and sign a peace agreement. Seeing the situation and the fact that many people were dying and that the war, to be honest, was not going quite according to the script that had been written, Putin agreed and withdrew his forward units from Kiev. Before this withdrawal, everyone understood that Ukraine's days were numbered. Once again, these forces deceived us. It was the Vatican and, surprisingly, the Jewish lobby. They, on behalf of Zelensky, declared, that's it, let's make peace, we agree, and others too. So Dmitry and I obviously were on the cutting edge of talking about how Russia's Jewish lobby and Russia's desire to still be connected with the rest of the West, and the same people that want Russia to defend the 2 million Russian Jews in Israel, those are the same people preventing Russia from doing what needs to be done in Ukraine. And Lukashenko is apparently willing to talk about that. So God bless him. But with this in the midst of the massive Ukrainian strikes on Russia recently, again, when you put all this in conjunction with the new aggression by Israel against Turkey and the Turkish aggression against Greece, and the fact that negotiations between Russia and Ukraine seem farther away than ever, World War III and all of these fronts fully connecting seems more likely than ever. And again, St. Paisios, all the saints talk about how it will be the Zionists that want to get us there. St. Joseph, Elder Joseph of Altopidi said, the Zionists want to control, the Jews want to control the world, and they will, get us into a world war to get there. And that's, Lukashenko's talking about how it's being gamed out on behalf of the Jewish lobby. So again, this war in Ukraine could have been wrapped up a long time ago, but apparently Jews had different ideas. So with the latest strikes on Moscow, Dmitry, perhaps you have the details on everything going on between Russia and Ukraine. Regarding Belarus, of course, we did see Zelensky, this is from CIG, it says Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky threatened to attack Belarus if Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko doesn't withdraw from Ukraine's border, targeting systems which are allegedly helping Russian drones and cruise missiles accurately hit their targets. So they have targeting systems that are apparently feeding information to Russian missile launchers that are launching things into Ukraine. Zelensky also claimed Belarus is selling fuel to Russia, claiming that Russia can no longer provide fuel for its armed forces after the many drone strikes on oil refineries. Belarusian officials stated yesterday that they will defend themselves after a Ukrainian drone struck a bus inside Bryansk Oblast, Russia, carrying 24 Belarusian children for a competition. One person was killed and several children were wounded. So Belarus seems to be coming more and more into the fore. I don't know why Lukashenko would make a statement like that if he wasn't potentially prepared to, help with an increased war effort, that to achieve what should have been done. But Dmitry, I'd love your thoughts on all of these recent comments regarding Belarus, as well as the details about the massive Ukrainian drone attack on Moscow, on the refineries, as well as what else is going on the ground in Ukraine itself.
Yeah, the most interesting thing is that Zelensky is not entirely wrong. Belarus has been supporting and helping Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation in fighting the war against Ukraine. It's not even the radar systems, which no doubt Belarus has installed. I mean, Belarus literally has Oreshnik missiles now installed on its territory, which, again, they haven't fired from Belarus into Ukraine yet. But what's the difference from them firing from Arkhangelsk or whichever location? Again, Belarus has a large Wagner contingent, veterans of the Russo-Ukrainian war stationed in Belarus, training Belarusian soldiers. These are people who've killed, at this point, probably hundreds, if not thousands of Ukrainians and, those subservient minions of Zelensky. So in many ways, and Belarusian hospitals actually have Russian soldiers in them and have assisted Russian soldiers wounded in battle, especially from oblasti next to Belarus, like Bryansk, Kursk, for a long time now. Essentially, since the beginning of the war, there's no sort of issues. In fact, the Belarusian-Russian Federation border is essentially wide open for just casual transportation. And generally speaking, there is no natural geographic boundaries between two countries. And we understood this from the very beginning. So Zelensky complaining now about Lukashenko, I mean, he himself also has, from the very start of the conflict, positioned close to 100,000 Ukrainian troops. Yes, most of them fresh conscripts and newly mobilized. And in fact, they're probably grateful that they are stationed along the Belarusian-Ukrainian border, so in those northwestern sections and not, shall we say, on the eastern front where, the real battles are happening in the cities of Bakhmut, Konstantinovka, Mariupol, Kupiansk, throughout the time, and Avdiivka, all these major battles, these troops have avoided that by being stationed on the Belarusian border where it's relatively safe and secure and very peaceful. So in fact, there is a large contingent of Ukrainian troops that have not really seen battle. All they've been doing is essentially manning their stations in case there is a secondary strike from President Lukashenko and his colleagues if President Putin asks for that. But perhaps Lukashenko himself, we're not sure, but it does appear that he has been extremely resistant to actually opening up a second front. Personally speaking, he's been very neutral, and I think he personally wants to avoid allowing Belarus to become involved in order for the country not to be placed under increased economic sanctions. We also note Belarus has been really warming up towards the US in recent years, specifically over the last 12 months. Lukashenko, for the first time in his life, spoke to Trump, was it a few months ago, over the telephone, and they've released all those Belarusian dissidents from prisons. And so there's already a warming of Belarus and, shall we say, countries of maybe not the European Union, but specifically the United States that's happening. And yes, if Belarus was to join into now it would turn the war into like a tripartite conflict between the three brotherly Russian peoples, then in fact that would, I think, complicate things for maybe what Lukashenko sees as his possible succession plans. Who knows exactly what he wants for the future of Belarus, politically speaking, but it does appear that maybe he's not on the same page as many Russian patriots in terms of having Belarus join itself to Russia, because that hasn't really been on Lukashenko's agenda. And now this is almost a different idea as to why. Maybe Lukashenko doesn't entirely trust the government of Vladimir Putin and United Russia. You have to keep in mind, I think he feels used. Maybe he feels he needs to keep them at arm's length to some extent. Obviously, they're very friendly and they go to pilgrimages and they've been to Valam together and all these other things. The photo ops are quite powerful, but we just have to understand there hasn't been a clear joining of these two allies for some reason, and it does surprise me to some extent. And from whom is this initiative of keeping a distance coming from? Is it Lukashenko, or is it Vladimir Putin simply keeping Lukashenko as a plan B? It depends who's driving this particular idea. Now, obviously, the most terroristic strikes against Russia have taken place again this week. It's almost on a weekly basis now, Conrad. We see news stories about, and we see actual footage coming from the ground. The strikes against St. Petersburg, Moscow. It's no more of these like long-range distance strikes against distant towns and cities, which most people have never heard about. This week, there's been an attack of over 200 drones flew towards the capital city of Russia, Moscow. And in particular, many tens of drones have landed successfully, striking a Russian oil refinery in very close to the capital city, specifically located southeast of Moscow. So this is, again, the outskirts of the city. You can kind of tell who even populates these particular, more or less, industrial areas of Moscow. They're not the most prestigious suburbs, but the footage of the destruction, including the black plumes of smoke and the drones hitting they were hitting actual civilian apartments as well. And this is the really disgusting factor of it all. It's not like the Ukrainians were targeting military bases, and the Russians actually, to speak in their favor, they actually had missile interceptors positioned in this particular distant suburb of Moscow. So that's quite curious. They had Buk systems, Panzer systems, and yes, there is footage of the interceptors not being entirely successful in these attacks against the Russian oil refinery and the civilian apartment buildings. But it does show you that the Russians are aware that they need a wide net. They need exceptionally placed missile defense systems across basically their entire European landmass in order to defend themselves against the onslaught of Ukrainian drones and now Flamingo missiles flying into these, so to speak, near military sites, this was an oil refinery, which Ukraine is claiming the oil from this particular refinery is being used for military logistics purposes. But yeah, there haven't been any reports of casualties, but there have been injuries from this particular bombardment. And keep in mind, there are actual civilians working at the oil refinery, just like, Homer Simpson working at the nuclear reactor in that famous American TV show. There are Russian, just regular guys and regular women working at these particular industries. And yes, they had literal Ukrainian terroristic drones smashing into them and blowing things up. So it's completely insane. And will there be an answer from Russia? Because the footage is, of course, very horrendous. There's been obviously calls within the Russian government to suppress, and I think openly it's already been passed, sort of executive decisions to suppress any publication of the footage of Ukrainian drone attacks. So it's very similar legislation that's been passed in Israel, and I believe so in Iran as well, where they simply say, no, you cannot post footage of attacks against the Russian Federation. And I understand maybe the only place that hasn't done so is Ukraine, where they openly publicize attacks of the Russian Federation, for example, against strategic Ukrainian objectives inside of town cities. And then they sort of push that out as saying, look, this is what Russia is doing to the innocent people of Ukraine. So it's almost like it might actually benefit Russia from allowing the propagation of this footage out so that they can show that Ukraine does not mind actually smashing suicide drones into civilian apartments. Like it might actually benefit the already weak and already quite, let's just say, subpar propaganda service of the Russian Federation. That's just my short criticism. And I think, like, generally speaking, the footage is not that horrendous if we really consider the fact that Ukraine attempted to breach Russian defenses of over 200 drones and only a small fraction of them succeeded. And we still, I think, await this week, Conrad, we're going to be waiting these next 7 or so days for a proper Russian response, because this is another red line has been crossed, and there are drones literally flying almost past the Moscow River, deep into Moscow suburbs. The very curious thing about the bombing as well is, if you watch the footage very closely, you'll notice the footage is obviously from just civilian mobile phones out of their windows or from the street. And you'll see listen to the accents of the people filming. Some of them are speaking even in non-Russian foreign languages. You can clearly see this is not the most prestigious suburb of Moscow. This is where the Gastarbeiter live. This is where the Central Asian working migrants reside. So if in a very apocalyptic scenario, if there was an all-out NATO versus Russian Federation war, and there would be similar waves of long-range missiles and drones flying at these suburbs, a suburb such as this one would be probably one of the ripe locations where order would break down, where the local Russian police would be overwhelmed because of the male migrant presence in these particular areas. Like, these are non-Russian, essentially, entities residing in these areas. They're simply there to work and to earn a living and to send their money back home to Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, or whichever other countries they've originally come from. So you just keep in mind, and this was one of the fears of the Prigozhin revolt back in June of 2023, they feared that as soon as Prigozhin would enter into Moscow, there would be a complete breakdown of all of these suburban, essentially these big suburb hives of apartments along the outskirts of Moscow, because the Russian police and the Russian National Guard would not be able to keep all of these migrants in check. And there are millions of migrants, so you just have to keep in mind the Ukraine, I think, sort of knows what it's doing, and some of the footage and the people filming the destruction as well, it just shows you there's an additional factor. And this is why our good friend Andrei Afanasyev has even started, along with his colleague of the Russian community, Ruskaya Община, to even try and defend against a lot of this migrant crime. So this is an additional factor to what we saw this week. Obviously the terroristic bombing of Russian civilian facilities. But on the front lines, Russia is clearly still progressing through the cities of Kupiansk and Konstantinovka. They've not been taken yet. The Russian bombing is intensifying, and the Russians are still defending in Zaporozhye, specifically in Primorsk and Stepnogorsk, these two sort of frontier cities on the Dnieper River, leading up to, they're very close to Zaporozhye, within a day's march, really. But in World War II terms, either the Red Army or the Third Reich would have reached Zaporozhye by, they would reach it by the time you're listening to this episode. But by the standards of modern warfare, Russians have been in Primorsk and Stepnogorsk for a long time now, and it doesn't appear that they're actually going to be moving forward. And keep in mind, there have been calls for mobilization as a response to Ukrainian intensified bombings against St. Petersburg and Moscow. But there's also been, there were analysts and quite, conservative, I would say hawkish analysts, who are saying that even a mobilization now would actually be counterproductive, because a large portion of the Russian population is tired of the war. They would treat mobilization as like a forced government action. They're already tired of the conflict. It's already longer than World War I and World War II. For the Russian people, this is a very lengthy, prolonged issue, and it hasn't been resolved. And another mobilization may frustrate the Russian civilian population a lot more than maybe if the war was to end on a sort of subpar ceasefire agreement, similar to what we see between Russia and Iran. So it is between the US and Iran. So in some way, I think, but it does. What's really telling as well, Conrad, is that both Ukraine and Russia are in some ways running out of forces. Like, there is obviously new waves of conscripts, new waves of mobilized troops, but the Russians are using their airborne commandos on the ground. For example, Primorsk and Stepnogorsk and Zaporozhye, the units holding that are largely comprised of men who in decades past would have joined the armed forces for the purposes of jumping off of planes with parachutes. Like, these are airborne commandos who are now fighting on the ground on the banks of the Dnieper River, holding apartment buildings and defensive trenches. Like, they're not really doing what they've trained for. And they're also, for example, in Dnipropetrovsk, in that particular oblast, Dnipro Oblast, or in Konstantinovka, there are Russian Marines, so basically armed forces of the Navy fighting there. So it's a complete mismatch of like a mixed armed force from the Russians actually fighting in this conflict. There are obviously National Guardsmen as well fighting near the front lines, or at least defending Russian rearguard positions. So, and this just shows you that, well, that's because the Russian army simply hasn't had a full-on mobilization. So now they're utilizing troops and infantry from different parts, from the Navy, from the airborne commandos, and it's just really curious. But on the Ukrainian end, we're seeing very similar things. In fact, the Ukrainian government right now is issuing increased pushes to mobilize more and more troops. And there's more investigations into even the corruption. And there's been a story that was published this week from Odessa, for example. So even Ukraine is kind of trying to streamline its recruitment process. So in Odessa, the recruitment office, the local recruitment office in Odessa, uncovered basically an entire extortion bandit gang that was controlling the local recruitment office in the city of Odessa. That was allegedly, besides just mobilizing and kidnapping people from the streets, it would send them to particular training camps in Odessa where the men would be, how do I say this nicely, they would be sexually assaulted by the Ukrainian kidnappers. They would be extorted. They would be asked to transfer their money voluntarily, of course through coercion, to the Ukrainian trainers at these mobilized camps. They would be exploiting them for all kinds of ways, obviously beating, subjugating them to torture, etc. So the Ukrainians are trying to streamline and fix their own very harsh, already, very World War II-esque recruitment conscription process, and it's not going all too smoothly. And so we have these crazy stories coming out, even from Odessa, which is very far from the front lines, that Ukrainian troop recruiters are abusing their own men, and there are these scandalous stories coming out of Ukraine. And so this is why Ukraine heavily relies on drone forces to basically fix those gaps that it has along the front lines in terms of manpower. And so Ukraine is, whatever the issues there are in terms of Russian shortage of men on the front lines, the Ukrainians are suffering that 4, if not 5 times fold, and that's a major issue. And this is why we haven't seen a counteroffensive by the Ukrainians since, well, you can say the middle of 2023, since they've wasted all of their Abrams tanks, etc. So at this point, Conrad, it does appear that we are sort of waiting for a Russian proper retaliation. There's been no official statement. I mean, there's been a condemnation statement by Lavrov's Ministry of Foreign Affairs office, but generally speaking, we haven't seen Andrei Belarusov say anything, nor Vladimir Putin expressly condemn the attacks against the Moskovskaya Oblast. And at this point, it's almost become normal. Like, stories about Moscow being bombed or St. Petersburg being attacked, or the Leningradskaya Oblast, where St. Petersburg is located, being invaded by Ukrainian drones. It's not even surprising anymore. It's almost like hearing stories about Israeli atrocities in Lebanon. This is something that's, I think, unfortunately become almost a new reality. It's clear that Zelensky himself is agreeing, he's green-lighting these attacks, because he's issuing speeches after the attacks where he's openly stating, yeah, these attacks are, justified and rightful, fair retaliations against the strikes against Kiev and some of our locations. So it's quite clear that Zelensky really wants to put the Russian civilian population on notice that, this war is basically turning into a total war, and is the Russian population ready to accept that? And I'm not too sure, especially, a lot of the weight is actually in Putin's camp as to exactly how is he going to respond to these recent attacks and atrocity attempts.
No, it's true. And again, I don't know what the Russian response exactly is going to be. Like, they already needed to change the force posture more than they frankly have in response to the Lugansk school bombing. They need to just, we were talking about this off air, you're mentioning this just now. They need to be putting hundreds of thousands of new troops and actually securing some of these fronts. They need to wrap things up in Donetsk itself in the next month and a half, and then start moving into Kharkov, start moving into Dnipropetrovsk, moving on Zaporozhye city, recrossing the river into Kherson. This is what needs to happen. So I just like your thoughts, Dmitry. Do we have any indication on what that aggression is going to look like, what this escalation will look like? Because anything short of that, I think, is unacceptable. And another question, I guess, about a specific situation was the Dormishin Cathedral, the damage at the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra. Some have claimed it was a Russian drone. Others said it was a Ukrainian Patriot air defense missile. I, of course, lean more towards it being the air defense missile based on the type of damage that was done. But those two questions, I'd love your response.
Yeah, I kind of take almost an independent position. I do think it was a Ukrainian interceptor missile that hit the cathedral. Just to start, this was a huge, big headline, booming story this week, and really it's only been overtaken by the fact that Israel's committed atrocities and now that this new bombardment of Moscow. But this particular story almost was filmed for strictly like Ukrainian propaganda purposes. There was even footage of, photographs of strange cameras being set up outside of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, almost in anticipation of the alleged accident taking place and the Dormishin Cathedral roof beginning to burn. The damage, of course, is not irreparable. It's quite fixable. It's not like in the past where during the Second World War, the various cathedrals of Kiev city would be destroyed, or even during the Mongol invasion where the entirety of Kiev was burnt down and almost destroyed in its entirety, including many relics of saints were lost during the Mongol sacking of Kiev. But this is something that's, just quite minor, I think. Even in July of 2023, there was a Ukrainian interceptor missile that, again, landed on the roof of the Transfiguration Cathedral in the city of Odessa. This was a giant cathedral, almost the same size as this one in Kiev. It was the capital cathedral of the city of Odessa, and you recall there was the same blaming of Russian long-range missiles or interceptor drones. I think in that story, they blamed it. They said it was an Iskander missile or something of that sort. Now, look, an Iskander missile or a Russian Giran drone carrying 90 kilograms of explosives would have, frankly, destroyed the entire roof. There would be a hole in that cathedral on top of it, unfortunately. There'd be all the icons inside would be destroyed. The ceiling would be completely hollow. The fact that I think it's probably a Soviet-grade interceptor missile, maybe not even a Patriot. Again, the load of that explosion was very minor. Yes, there was a fire that started and the tiles were destroyed, etc. But it's not like you even saw any of the bell towers being taken out. I think the explosion was it was unfortunate that it took place, but some of the real rhetoric coming out from people who they considered themselves somewhat centrist in the Russo-Ukrainian war conflict, speaking out that, look, Russia needs to stop bombing churches. Like, this is almost like a nothing burger in terms of a story. Yes, it's unfortunate the cathedral was hit. I don't even leave it out for, there's a chance when you're sending thousands of drones into battle that a particular drone, just like the Russian drone, the Shahed that accidentally landed in I think it was the greenhouse of the Metropolitan of Odessa. It landed into his almost close to his home, and that was a complete accident because the drone basically lost communication and it just landed into a greenhouse, into the garden of the Metropolitan of Odessa. And things like this do happen, but this specific story, if you look at the footage, and there's already people that have been actually on the roof of the cathedral, including Zelensky himself, and the photographs taken of Zelensky on the roof of the cathedral looking extremely concerned. You have to keep in mind, this is all a Talmudic farce. Zelensky is the guy who, in early 2023, kicked out a majority of the monks from the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra. This cathedral is an occupied cathedral. This is the one where they've carried out ecumenist services. They've turned the cathedral into a museum, into an ecumenist site of some sort of evil, cross-religious worship. It's completely occupied. And look, it's been said this week that there's only 140 monks or so throughout the entire Kiev-Pechersk complex who still remain living there, but they're going to be ousted very soon once an appellatory process is closed and the Ukrainian courts basically ordered them to be taken out. There's going to be police raids and all the monks are going to be seized. Metropolitan Paul, the caretaker of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, is on house arrest. So for Zelensky to claim, Russians have hit our cathedral, he's basically, from his position, think about it, he's an Orthodox Talmudic Chabad Lubavitch Jew. He's basically saying our museum, our palace has been hit, our sort of UNESCO location being struck. For him, it's not a cathedral, it's simply a big, beautiful building. So just keep in mind the perspective there. It's complete nonsense. And clearly, for Russia, just in relation to how Russia can essentially begin advancing on the front lines, absolutely, I think there's a huge propaganda war that needs to be conducted by the Russians when they liberate Svyatogorsk Lavra. There needs to be Russian commanders, maybe even Russian politicians need to risk it, travel to the Svyatogorsk Lavra. Literally, Medvedev himself needs to go there, needs to interview on camera some of the monks, talk about Ukrainian atrocities. They need to speak about general things like Russo-Ukrainian, the brotherhood between the two peoples. There needs to be a big push for once the entirety of Donetsk Oblast falls, for almost a domino-like effect for some of the other towns and cities to essentially not prepare for a coming Russian onslaught, but to prepare to essentially capitulate to Russian liberation efforts in the near future. So there needs to be the Donetsk People's Republic. Unfortunately, those territories occupied by Ukraine, they've artificially sort of turned them into these fortresses. But all the other towns and villages and cities that are still, not depopulated and they have Ukrainian civilians living there, the Russians need to really help improve their propaganda effort. And I mean propaganda in the most positive sense. They need to put out the message that the Russians are not coming here to destroy your homes. They're coming here to essentially oust this terroristic regime of Zelensky. And this just needs to be pushed further onwards. And I think this is when you're talking about Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, this is the first purposeful liberation that needs to happen. And maybe even they need to speak about the atrocities that happened in 2014 and 15 and interview some of the locals, anyone who remembers these areas as they were before the Maidan regime took over, before Poroshenko came to power, etc. Like, there needs to be like a very major push towards what will happen to, Russo-Ukrainian dialogue after we liberate these last territories of the Donetsk People's Republic. So again, there's a lot of pressure on the Russian mainstream media to sort of make that happen, especially those who receive millions of dollars from the Russian government, these grants to push forward the message. But I think they need to do a better job. Like, Kherson is the same. Remember how many people did Russia allow to leave Kherson? There was, I think, tens of thousands of Khersonites left the city in an exodus after Russia abandoned the city in late 2022, when it was very clear they couldn't hold it as a bridgehead on the other side of the Dnieper, which I think was a mistake in the long term against Ukraine. Russia could have turned Kherson into a proper second front bridgehead of sorts. And now, as you said, Conrad, it's almost too difficult to cross the Dnieper River, and take the city of Kherson by surprise. But I think it can be done, especially if, and we know Russia has forces. They've conducted trainings in late 2025. We've seen at least 200, 300,000 additional troops Russia has that are trained, mobilized pretty much, and ready to go on command. It's only a matter of, what is Russia waiting for? And I think one of the hints is you see this weird posturing from the Russian people close to the heights of Russian media in the newsphere. People like, obviously, the Sergei Karaganov, who I mentioned last week, the weird guy who's on his mother's side is, descendant from Muscovite rabbis, shall we say. I don't even know how to say this very nicely, but he's calling on Russian media and appearing all over American media, claiming that NATO is going to have a war with Russia very, very soon. And this is what I think, unfortunately, these fears of the future NATO war, Conrad, are in fact almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if Russia doesn't resolve this Russo-Ukrainian war quickly and soon, then in fact the NATO war is kind of looming on the horizon eventually, right? Because obviously the process of agitation and the NATO arms being given to Ukraine will continue to perpetrate and agitate the situation. But if the conflict, and if the SMO finishes and it reaches its goals and it finalizes, then in fact Russia can begin having this new dialogue with NATO. But what this guy is claiming, and many other analysts for some reason, including Solovyov Shapiro, is that Russia needs to attack NATO now, for whatever reason, to force the Ukraine to surrender, which is, I think, completely inappropriate. Russia needs to hyperfixate and focus itself. And these 250, 300,000 reinforcements that Russia has trained, positioned, they're conducting themselves in ready formations from Nizhny Novgorod all the way to Belarus. They're prepared to fight against the Ukraine or NATO, whomever they're sent against. In a way, they're being kept as a plan B in case NATO aggression becomes quite evident and Russia goes into a war with NATO. But I think they need to be instead maybe devoted and maybe implemented in Ukraine now to maybe stop that major Russo-European war from taking place again. We don't want another World War I or World War II recreating itself, or another Swedish invasion of Russia. That's what the globalists, I think, are hoping for. That would cause an immense amount of damage, I think, to the European psyche as well, and to any sort of right-wing regimes within Europe. It will completely murder them in the cradle, and hopefully that doesn't happen. But Russian analysts, especially those of the more Talmudic touch, are really pushing for an outright European war to take place. And yes, they're going to claim that Europe is satanic, but without really seeing the reality is that, I think, unfortunately, Conrad, just like Ukraine is possessed by certain demons, Europe is also tainted and just contaminated with hyper-liberal ideas. And the best thing Russia can really do is end the SMO and begin pushing out Christian right-wing ideas into Europe to essentially make them healthy and correct again.
100%. It's never been easier. Lukashenko named them. There's never been a time in history when people are more aware of the Jewish lobby, the influence that world Jewry has on people's on a nation's national interests, both domestically and abroad. It's never been, I think, more appropriate on the national scale to move against them in your country, but Putin doesn't seem interested in that. And you're right, Dmitry. Unfortunately, Lukashenko doesn't seem as eager to reunite with Russia as potentially we would hope he is. And maybe that's part of why he's naming the Jew. Maybe naming the Jew is another way to distance himself from Russia, who seem not willing to do that openly. But we do have, as far as Russia's allies go, we have some satellite imagery from the Burmese military junta's Yangon naval facilities showing something quite interesting. This is from an analyst. It says, it is recently completed in a recently completed Chinese-built shipbuilding facility. The junta appears to be building at least one submarine. I've previously reported on the junta's obsession with their navy and how they dump large amounts of cash on oversized, impractical warships. However, they have never before built a submarine. It is unclear if this is a standalone project or a cooperation with A, the Russian Navy, the branch of the Russian military which is closest to its Burmese counterpart, and B, North Korea, who seems to have their own domestic submarine production, or C, both of them. So interesting developments. The junta has been managing to retake certain territories in recent weeks. We also have Cuba. In the past few weeks, they have approved multiple market reforms to their economy, including the reintroduction of private real estate development, the privatization of state-owned businesses, and they will allow the entry of private banks into the finance sector. I don't know if they think this will be enough to save them from American aggression, but it's clear that America and Marco Rubio and these others have decided that they want to move on Cuba regardless. So I'd say this is too little, too late, and you're letting the foreign banks in anyway. We kind of all know how that is going to go. Other two stories I wanted to discuss before we hit church news, and I'd love your thoughts on these, Dmitry. Before we transition to that, we of course had the rape gang inquiry commissioned by Rupert Lowe and the Restore Britain Party, who are again continuing to grow in power and prestige. Apparently Nigel Farage is hiring consultants and trying to shift his digital media strategy because he's getting completely outperformed and out-engaged by Rupert Lowe. One of the most disturbing screenshots from the massive report, which details, I think, from the early 60s on to now, about 250,000 rapes and sexual assaults on British white girls by migrants, mostly Pakistani, but also Indians, Sikhs, Bangladeshis, Africans, all these other undesirables. And one of the screenshots that's really been going around, it says, when Fiona's mother called the police to report her daughter missing and mentioned a history of abuse by Asian men, the call handler told her, "You can't describe them as Asian men because that's racist. You should just be glad your child is being taught a different culture." On one occasion, a police officer returned Fiona to the house where the abuse was occurring and told the men to have fun with her. On another occasion, police instructed the abusers that if they could persuade Fiona to sign herself out of care, the police would stop bothering them. So one of the most disturbing aspects of this was how complicit local police, local judiciaries, all sorts of other political bodies were in this certain gang rape, sex, dungeon cult situations where these migrants were raping. These girls had like police nights where the local police would participate in the sexual assaults. So really just disgusting stuff. And again, much like Henry Nowak, who was accused of racism after being stabbed by a Sikh and then arrested and not believed when he was stabbed, so too do these people call someone calling an Asian men isn't even accurate. You should be calling them brown shit-skinned Muslims, is frankly is what they deserve to be called, pardon my French, but that's who these disgusting people are. And people are offended by the Asian demonym as if these people are not Japanese. These are not Koreans. These are inbred Muslim Pakistani freaks. And the idea that somehow it would be racist referring to them when they're raping your child is, again, all of these people, like that 911 operator, the cops involved, they should all be hung. They should all be executed publicly in the streets. And the fact that, again, the British Big Brother Zog system spends so much more capital persecuting right-wingers and the people in Belfast that protested and go against this stuff than they do these actual people is just disgusting. You can go to Rupert Lowe's Twitter and read the full rape gang inquiry report. It's very comprehensive stuff, so be sure to check that out. But it's grim, so I don't necessarily recommend it. But if you want to understand the severity of the situation our civilization is facing, then that might be something worth checking out. But here's something we talk about this extensively with Yaqub Saraf in our Ether Hour episode with him, so everyone be sure to check that out. It is linked down below. But this was from a Turkish journalist, Sabri Sashuvar, who is a journalist and columnist out of Istanbul. I believe he is broadly aligned with Erdogan. I don't know his exact editorial bent, but he's fairly popular in Turkey. It says here, this is an announcement to the relevant institutions. It has been leaked that the Pentagon has issued an order to U.S. troops and their families not to travel to Turkey or Greece. It has been stated that allied friends have shared that Greece will declare the 12 nautical miles in the islands region as state policy in August or September and is engaged in war preparations. There is information that in back-channel diplomacy, Israel has decided on a war against Turkey involving the Greek Cypriot administration, France, and Greece. It is emphasized that Israel will launch missile strikes on Turkey targeting energy and infrastructure and will use extensive technological and logistical support to paralyze our air forces. Information is being shared that Greece has agreed with Israel to enter the war, gain territory in Turkey's west, and annex the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus with extraordinary logistical support. The U.S. will provide the military and intelligence support to Israel without directly entering the war. France will intervene on behalf of Greece and take a direct position as a belligerent party. Information is being shared that the U.S. Navy is fortifying logistics in the Mediterranean region to directly support the Greek Cypriot administration. The entirety of Cyprus will come under Greek control. The PKK will be activated. A Kurdish state will be established in Syria, and Israel and France will provide direct ammunition support. It is clear that America and France have entered a dirty game to transfer sovereignty rights over the islands region to Greece against Russia. It can be seen that relevant authorities in the Pentagon have sent a directive to relevant units, canceling many trips to Turkey and Greece in August, September, and October. Now, it's important to know there's no real sources for this. This is just a Turkish journalist talking about this. But to me, it's just crazy how he basically just laid out what will happen with the prophecies. He even mentioned Russia briefly as far as the Aegean sort of being turned against Russia after Turkey is sort of defeated by the U.S. and Israel. Obviously, it talks about Cyprus. It talks about Kurdistan. So again, this is very relevant to what Metropolitan Theophitos talked about. I always read that excerpt from that homily he gave in January 2026, where he talks about how a Kurdish state will be activated. Erdogan will fall after Trump, pumps Erdogan up. And then eventually, of course, this will cause the Russians to descend. This is how Cyprus will be liberated, as was just described in this post from the Turkish journalist. So very fascinating stuff. And it's important to recognize that, again, Greece, may not be participating particularly directly, but it talks about the blue homeland situation. Of course, Greece will perhaps reassert their 12 nautical miles of their exclusive economic zone off the coast of their islands. And then it might be reduced to 6. And then the Turks will try to do their blue homeland law, reduce that down to 6 and impede upon the Aegean Islands. And then this could cause a provocation that Israel will capitalize upon, use as they've been planning to target Turkey, potentially do secure things in Cyprus to secure a base of operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon. Because right now, Cypriot intelligence and the Cyprus operators of the Akrotiri and Dikalia RAF bases there are not interested in operating against Cyprus. They got hit by like 1 or 2, operating against Lebanon and Hezbollah. They got hit by like 1 or 2 drones and we're like, no, we're out. So very, very interesting developments. Jakub Sarov talks about this again. So he gives his take on this fully. So check that out in this week's Ether Hour episode, link down below. But he even talks about France, which the prophecies of St. Paisios talk about European countries entering into this conflict basically to seize land, much similar to, the Sykes-Picot Agreement in the end of World War I, where, again, Russia effectively was supposed to be given Constantinople, and that is supposedly how this will end as well. But the idea of Israel and Greece moving on Turkey, again, how Russia will then, again, Russia right now is probably more anti-Israel than ever, even if Putin himself isn't. So with the situation in Iran, with Erdogan falling and being turned over to the more Kemalists, it would make sense how, Israel would move against Turkey. Turkey could potentially, or maybe take out Erdogan, and then Turkey could then be moving against Greece. The Kemalists could take over. Greece could sort of be operating slightly on the side of Israel in the background, very pleased with the Cyprus situation, pleased with Turkey falling. But, then the new Turkish government will sort of be pressured in their weak state to close the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits to Russia. Russia will move on them. They'll win. The Greeks will realize they made a big mistake siding with Israel, but the Russians will perhaps give them the Thracian side of Constantinople, or perhaps eventually there will be a new, perhaps John Vatatzis will emerge, right? We're getting very speculative at this point, but I'd love your thoughts on, of course, the rape gang inquiry, Dmitry. Not a whole lot there. I think you agree with my analysis, but also this interesting prediction where apparently the U.S. is preparing for, September, October, November, big things going down between Greece, Turkey, Israel, much in the vein of the prophecies of St. Paisios.
The inquiry of Rupert and the issues that it raises, I think those stories, they're so horrific to read, and I did read a large portion of that document, but I think it's not recommended for all people, but I think it does paint the picture of this is what the multicultural future of Europe would look like if the globalists do win, if, of course, the Talmudic lobby does does obtain what it wants. You have to just refer to the rape statistics in Germany and Sweden. There's another example. Obviously, these gangs have been in place for at least 50 years, so it's not surprising that they've reached such a level of prominence. I would also just add that, very interestingly, British police, especially English police, have been very heavily Masonized. Freemasonry among the British police force was an active issue. In fact, it was just commonplace culture during the times, for example, when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote Sherlock Holmes, so roughly from 1887 until the early 1900s. In fact, it's one of the ways Freemasonry actually infiltrated into the Russian imperial police force, because the Russian Empire was copying a lot of the early policing practices in the gendarmes from the British Empire, was because, frankly, unfortunately, it's because the British police was entirely Masonic at that point, in fact. So it is quite interesting that the police was somewhat in fact assisting. I wouldn't even be surprised if many of those police officers assisting in perpetrating the rape gang activity, Conrad, were in fact migrants themselves, which again would not, that would just play into the greater trope of things that, look, Britain is essentially completely occupied by a government that doesn't really represent the people, nor is it monarchical in any way. Unfortunately, Charles III has not commented, nor did any of the royal family members, about exactly what Rupert Lowe has been putting forward here. So it's just completely disgusting. It's probably just as gross as some of the stories and the reports being released by, I believe it was Amnesty International, the UN, reports of what happens to Palestinians in Israeli prisons. And I don't recommend reading those either, but it's very similar. In fact, the conduct, the abuse of the prisoners or the captives is very similar. So there is almost a kinship between the Pakistanis and the radical Zionist Israelis as to what they do to human beings made in the image of God if they have power over them. It's really horrific and disgusting. And yes, the abuse has gone quite far. But just in relation to what's taking place, at least planning-wise, and what the journalists are in a way predicting, right, between Greece, Turkey, Russia, and the Eastern Mediterranean, the Aegean. I think the other aspect of it, Conrad, is that the reality is Russians have 3 military bases within range of the Turks. These bases, I think the Turks have been viewing them as threats into the long term. In fact, you could almost say that Russia in some ways has Turkey surrounded through the Khmeimim Latakia Tartars base and the Gyumri base in the east in Armenia, and obviously just north, the Black Sea has been dominated by Russia since the First World War. So there's a clear pressure from Turkey to understand that, look, there is this Orthodox crescent, in a way, if you count Greece as Orthodox, stretching all around the Black Sea, reaching all the way into Syria. So in fact, Turkey does feel, in some ways, if you even count Greek Cyprus as an Orthodox land, as an Orthodox power of some sort, again, of limited capacity, the Turks are in fact completely surrounded by Orthodox bases. And so to not expect the future Turkish regime, right, if Erdogan does eventually fall, which I think he will, to come to power, to have some sort of anti-Orthodox Christian sentiments, reprisals against both Russians and the Greeks alike. In fact, this may be the one thing that unifies Russians and Greeks, is that the abuses that the Turks will be pushing on the Orthodox populations and what they will do to the garrisons of the bases, which they no doubt will try to take, probably with the assistance of some of the Sunni Muslim radicals in Syria, that is Tartus, Latakia, Khmeimim. How will they conduct themselves when they find Orthodox Christian icons in the barracks of the Russian troops located in Syria? Or what will they do to, for example, the Russian chapels located in Armenia, the churches and the chapels located nearby the Russian base in Gyumri? Like, these are footage of those places being desecrated, God forbid, will, I think, further encapsulate the hostilities between, and will again perpetrate them between Russia and Turkey in the long term. I think this is what will mobilize the populations of Russia against the Turks once again, as they historically have for many centuries before. And it's just, I think, really pertinent that I think in some way Turkish nationalists and these radical right-wing is, I think, relative, but even Turkish left and right-wing hawks within Turkey, they do feel this never-ending pressure. Like the Turkish state, in a way, think about it, Turkey in a way is somewhat artificial. They do know that they are invaders from Central Asia. They understand they are on this land not by invitation. They are here simply because they've conquered it. In a way, Israelis have the same level of hostility in the Middle East. They feel like they've taken the land by conquest, and then they need to hold it for sheer military might, as they are not natural residents of the land. Of course, many Turks today are simply assimilated members of local communities, going back to the Trojan War, just regular Anatolians, many of them of Greek, Armenian descent, but also probably the relatives of ancient Isaurians and other people living in the Turkish mountains. So it's all very complicated, but in fact, I think the Turks do understand that they will need to fight against their surrounding nations, and this sort of period of peace after World War II that the Turks have experienced. And in fact, as I would say, since World War I, it really eventually will unfortunately come to an end, because specifically between Turkey and Greece, this Gordian knot of complex relations, the fact that there is no natural border between Turkey and Greece. It should, in fact, probably be one country that, sort of controls those Ionian Islands and the locations on the West Anatolian peninsula. All of these complex issues, I think, will come to bear in the future. There's no doubt about that. The fact that the Orthodox Christian saints confirm it, I think, is completely aligns with anyone's natural, geopolitical, even historical analysis. It's quite, it's not surprising there. But specifically, if we just mention church news, there's been some, we've already mentioned one of the biggest stories this week, Conrad, and that was the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra Dormition Cathedral. As to who exactly bombed it, in my opinion, it was a small interceptor bomb from a Soviet-grade Ukrainian air defense missile system, most likely. And yes, that would even explain why the bomb even struck the cathedral in the first place. Maybe missing a Russian Giran drone. It's just the fact that the technology is somewhat obsolete, and the payload of that interceptor missile was so small that, frankly, the damage caused to the cathedral was quite minuscule. Like the Notre Dame fires, so the Notre Dame de Paris cathedral fire was much more destructive than the interceptor hitting the cathedral's roof. So I think overall, we just have to take it with a grain of salt, some of the reports about Russian war crimes, etc., with the bombing of the cathedral. Other news come from a very prominent spokesperson, and look, he said a lot of good things over the years in favor of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. That's the famous heavyweight boxing champion, Alexander Usyk. So he was in the US this week, and he ended up giving a press conference. And in the past, he's a great supporter of Metropolitan Onufriy. I think he was a subdeacon in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and he served specifically with many Ukrainian bishops. I think there was questions about, Ukraine doesn't really have a proper democracy these days, nor does it have religious freedom. And Usyk replied with a very, I would just say, somewhat devilish statement. He said Ukraine is the freest nation in the world. It has both religious freedom and it has democratic freedoms, which is completely insane. So I don't know if that's brain damage from the sustained strikes he took in participating in heavyweight boxing sport, or what exactly. But it's just a shame. Again, that's the issue, Conrad. Popularizing athletes sometimes isn't really the best thing in the world, especially bringing them to prominence in politics. It does have downsides in terms of, these people are, sometimes they grew to fame through making really hyper-exaggerated claims. They like to sometimes take things a little bit too intensely. The hyperbole in his statement that Ukraine is the freest nation on earth is just completely, I think it's disrespectful, even to his own Metropolitan Onufriy. So that was very bizarre that we even saw a son of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, one of its most famous members, I would say, of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in the world, the heavyweight boxer Usyk, saying Ukraine is free under the terroristic reign of Zelensky. Completely, I think, inappropriate. There was a very unfortunate act of desecration that took place in the Ukrainian city of Chernigov. There was a Transfiguration Cathedral, which was occupied some months ago by the false Ukrainian church run by Epiphany Domenko, and it was turned into this quasi-museum structure. And now there are tours being led by women tour guides into the altar of the cathedral. And the cathedral, mind you, still has these quasi-Orthodox ceremonies and liturgies taking place there. Whenever Epiphany Domenko or some of the local Chernigov schismatics choose to conduct their liturgies, of course, they turn the cathedral. They, of course, have all the heterodox leave the altar, but there are female tours being conducted within the cathedral walls itself. It's interesting that all of the tourists entering onto the altar are all women, and that's probably because a lot of the men of Chernigov have in fact been mobilized to the front lines, be they Orthodox, schismatic, or otherwise, which is very unfortunate. But what are the ladies doing in their spare time? I mean, they're touring Orthodox altars. And I mean, we know the Orthodox Christian tradition, no woman should step into an altar. I know there are extreme exceptions in the case of sometimes Orthodox Christian nuns or Orthodox Christian empresses. There's been, about 4 or 5 Orthodox Christian empresses who once in their life during the coronation anointing ceremony have entered into the altar to partake of communion. You cannot compare regular Karens from Ukraine entering into an Orthodox Christian altar as the same thing as an empress, right? This is completely inappropriate. So, meanwhile, obviously there's been calls by the director of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra to kick out 140 monks. So there's upcoming, most likely, atrocities that will be conducted against Kiev-Pechersk monasticism very, very soon. And yes, they've turned the entire Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, the largest monastery in Ukraine, into like a museum conservation site. It has the same status as a national park of sorts. And so the monks living in their little houses and little apartments and those monks who still remain on the land, technically they're like illegal squatters and they need to leave. So the entire monastery has been secularized. It's very Bolshevik of the Zelensky government. And notice this isn't a major issue for many people who are calling Russia the aggressor in this battle. It's like Zelensky literally chose to do that to secularize the largest monastery, in Eastern Europe. It's the second largest monastery in Eastern Europe, you can say. The other very controversial, I think, statement, and this is again reflective of the fact that the war goes on for so long that you have various hierarchs of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church essentially giving very cringe opinions, and this will continue onwards. But this week we had Metropolitan Vladimir of the Ukrainian cities of Kamensk and Charichansk. He basically gave an interview where he claimed Patriarch Kirill betrayed his Orthodox Christian children in Ukraine by essentially blessing the special military operation. Well, I just have to say, Patriarch Kirill never blessed the special military operation. It happened, I think, without his consent. It had just happened because of the political will of the Russian elites, right? And some of them are not Orthodox Christian. So let's just comment on that as well. It literally wasn't the decision of the Patriarch nor Metropolitans of Russia. It wasn't Metropolitan Tikhon Shevkunov or Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev who sanctioned this SMO. It happened simply because the secular government of Russia chose to conduct the SMO for their own reasons. Patriarch Kirill did, however, bless the Russian troops and has made pro-SMO statements after that. But Metropolitan Vladimir, this Ukrainian bishop, as he just clearly stated, like he said, look, he says originally in the interview, he says, I'm from Lugansk. I've seen the conflict from its very beginning, he says. And he tries to comment on the fact that Patriarch Kirill from the start has always said, our Orthodox people are on both sides of the war. So he's talking about the early Maidan 2014 Donbass war. And he says Patriarch Kirill has always taken a neutral position. And now he's surprised that Patriarch Kirill has started taking a very pro-Russian stance. And he says it's inappropriate. And then he boasted, this is why, me as a bishop, I was one of the first to stop commemorating Patriarch Kirill because I cannot agree with him. And like the difference here is completely insane. Doesn't he recognize the fact that the Zelensky government is openly persecuting the church? Like, yes, maybe his diocese hasn't been impacted yet, but there are other bishops his fellow bishops of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that have been imprisoned, that have been bullied, beaten, nearly killed, and given such psychological stress that many of them, of course, are at the moment they're having to visit hospital on regular occasions, and many of them are still facing court trials, and some are in prison. A lot of lower clergy, deacons, priests being kidnapped. Some of these metropolitans of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, they need a reality check, and I think that reality check, inevitably, Conrad, it will come to their particular diocese when their own priests, deacons, children of their own local diocese will begin to start getting kidnapped and recruited into the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. I think God will have a very harsh lesson for these particular, I would say hierarchs and some of the lower clergy who take very pro-Zelensky positions, because you can't take pro-Zelensky positions and expect the beast not to eat you. Like, he will come for you and your children, and he will forcefully recruit you, and maybe they will be abused in these Tetsika bases, like the ones exposed in Odessa recently. And that's the unfortunate reality, is you cannot compromise with a satanic power like the one that is in power in Ukraine, unfortunately. And it's sad that some people just haven't come to that realization yet.
Again, the Russians could be doing more on the propaganda front to make people more aware of this, as you were saying earlier. But speaking of satanic regimes that persecute churches, this is from Ortho Christian. The headline, Israeli forces raid Orthodox Patriarchate property in Jerusalem. Israeli forces carried out a raid on Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem land in the Silwan neighborhood of Jerusalem on Monday, June 15th, forcibly removing the Patriarchate's representative, confiscating his equipment, uprooting trees, and enclosing the property with fencing and gates. The seized land is registered in the Patriarchate's name under official records, lying adjacent to an ancient monastery containing historical, archaeological, and religious features. The Patriarchate described the operation as unlawful and illegitimate seizure of established church property and said it sets a dangerous precedent for church rights in Jerusalem. Israeli authorities relied on a municipal gardening order issued on April 18, 2019, whose term expired in April 2024. Patriarchate said the expired order provides no lawful basis for uprooting trees, removing the caretaker, sealing off the land, or denying the Patriarchate access to its own property. The Patriarchate placed the Silwan incident within a broader pattern of attacks on the Christian presence in the Holy Land. It said 111 attacks or acts of violence against Christian clergy, nuns, worshippers, and church communities were recorded in 2024, including 34 targeting churches, monasteries, and religious symbols. The statement also recalled the Israeli army's strike on the compound of St. Porphyrios Church in Gaza on October 19, 2023, which killed 18 civilians, and a strike on Holy Family Church on July 17, 2025, which killed 3 civilians and injured Father Gabriel Romanelli. The Patriarchate said protecting church property is a spiritual and historical trust, and cited the gospel passage, Blessed are the peacemakers, calling for respect for law property, holy places, and the dignity of Jerusalem's Christian presence. So nothing new under the sun. The Jews continue their slow, clearly supported by the state, persecution and encroachment on the Christian lands in Israel. Again, the Patriarchate of Jerusalem is the largest landowner in Jerusalem, specifically in the city, besides the state of Israel itself. So they're going to be the main victims of all of this. Some news from the American church here. We have a photo from the Juneteenth ecumenical prayer service at the St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church and National Shrine. We got Father Samuel Davis of Go Arch, participated with a bunch of black guys dressing up as clergymen who are no such thing. You had, in scare quotes, Father Don Purdom, a pretend Orthodox priest of the American Orthodox Catholic Church, as well as his bishop, quote unquote, Archbishop Wayne Daniels of the American Orthodox Catholic Church, who goes apparently by Archbishop Titus. Apparently that is his ecclesiastical name. And apparently this is what the Post said. It said, "We are blessed to host the annual Juneteenth ecumenical prayer service at St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church and National Shrine. The powerful service was a beautiful reflection on freedom, justice, and our shared journey toward healing and unity. We extend our heartfelt gratitude to our keynote speaker, Archbishop Titus, and they say of the Antiochian Orthodox Christian Archdiocese. And thank you to everyone from all traditions who gathered with us in prayer, reflection, and hope. May we continue to walk together in the light of freedom and love." So openly praying with heretics and not even schismatics, not even like, this aren't even Oriental Orthodox or Catholics. These are just random black guys who put on collars and suits and call themselves the American Orthodox Church. And this post has the audacity to say Archbishop Titus of the Antiochian Orthodox Christian Archdiocese, making people think that this random LARPer is part of the Antiochian Church, part of a canonical church. So this is this blatant ecumenism, blatantly condemned, of course, by many church statements. Terrible, but no one's going to condemn this. Of course, this is all in the name of anti-racism. Again, listen to my live stream, my World War live stream from Tuesday this past week, and you'll hear I talked about Metropolitan Nathaniel of Chicago condemning the cross burning in Grant Park in Chicago, which was, of course, a hoax committed by a left-wing Asian, but he condemned it as if it was a white supremacist. Everyone's looking for fake white supremacists and racist scandals that don't exist to condemn. Meanwhile, blatant Afrolatry and worship of black nonsense is occurring, in ecumenistic heretical nonsense in the middle of New York City at the massive St. Nicholas Church, which is surrounded by scandal in and of itself. Tens of millions of dollars went missing from the construction fund there. So very, very scandalous. Father Samuel Davis of Go Arch is a real problem. He's one of the worst as far as promoting this racism nonsense. And clearly the stuff in Go Arch is being moved forward behind the scenes by some very Americanist people. Because let's be real, does Alpildo Foros even know what Juneteenth is? Probably not. So this is obviously some Fordhamite type people behind the scenes pushing this agenda forward. And Father Samuel Davis has converted effectively no black people to Orthodoxy. His parish, I think, is a complete failure. I'm not sure he even runs the parish he was assigned anymore. His whole thing is a total joke. When you have other people like Father Turbo Qualls, who are actually just, preaching real Orthodox tradition, are converting people in the black community. So, just a bunch of clownery and nonsense from Go Arch and Samuel Davis and all of that. So again, no surprise there, but be prepared for that. But we had another news here. It said Bulgarian and Romanian churches condemn pride events. This is from Ortho Christian. It says the Orthodox churches of Bulgaria and Romania spoke out against pride events in their capitals this weekend, with His Holiness Bulgarian Patriarch Danil personally leading a family march through Sofia's streets. The Romanian Patriarchate issued a statement June 12th warning that Bucharest pride can lead to the accentuation of confusion of spiritual values in a society already affected by demographic decline and social instability. The church reaffirmed its teaching that family is founded on marriage between a man and a woman, and said public events promoting other models are met with concern and non-acceptance. It also reminded the faithful that the response of Orthodox Christians should be one illuminated by peace, prayer, and respect for the dignity of each person, explicitly rejecting offensive speech or violence as contrary to the gospel. A day later, Bulgaria's Holy Synod issued its own statement opposing Sofia Pride 2026, saying it couldn't approve the ideas and messages popularized through this event. The Synod warned against what it called attempts to present lifestyles incompatible with Christian moral teaching as a valid alternative to what is described as God's established order for human life. It expressed particular concern about such messaging being directed at children and youth who are still forming their values and personal identity, invoking the words of Christ, "Woe to the world because of offenses." The Bulgarian Church called on parents to watch over the spiritual and moral growth of their children and urged state institutions and civil society to support the strengthening of marriage and family. The Synod framed its opposition not as a rejection of individuals, saying the Church doesn't reject anyone and never stops praying for every person, but insisted that it had a duty to clearly bear witness to the gospel truth and protect its faithful children from spiritual delusion. True freedom, it said, lies not in affirming every desire, but in following the truth that liberates man and leads him to the fullness of life in God. The statements came ahead of the Sunday feast of all Bulgarian saints, which the Bulgarian church said made the moment especially significant. The synod drew on the example of the saints to argue that the struggle with passions, including carnal passions, is at the center of Christian life, and that sinful inclinations must never be normalized or held up as models to follow. Patriarch Daniel led Vespers and a Moleben for the Bulgarian family at St. Nedelia Church before joining the March for the Family that wound through major Sofia boulevards to Alexander Nevsky Square, where a concert followed. So even more news also against the resistance of homosexuality. Unfortunately, Greece, the only Orthodox country with homo marriage on the books. It says here, also from Ortho Christian, hundreds gathered in Thessaloniki last week to march in opposition to gay marriage, which has been legal in Greece since February 2024, and whose constitutionality was reaffirmed by the courts in March 2026. The peaceful protest titled Respect for the Greek Orthodox Family took place on June 13th, starting at the statue of Alexander the Great on the new waterfront and concluding outside the Church of the Hagia Sophia, reports the UOJ. A resolution approved at the event calls for the abolition of the gay marriage law, an end to pride events at Thessaloniki, and a revision of sex education in schools. Greetings were sent by His Eminence Metropolitan Seraphim of Kythera, the Church of Greece, His Eminence Metropolitan Tychikos, formerly of Paphos, the Church of Cyprus, the cell-dwelling fathers of the Holy Mountain, and the Center for Patristic Studies. Political greetings came from the Greek Solution Party, the Democratic Patriotic Movement Niki, the National Front, and independent Member of Parliament Nikolaos Papadopoulos. Speakers included retired Major General Dimitrios Kampisioulis, who addressed demographics in the family, energy consultant Theodosius, who spoke on the consequences of gender transition, an economics student who voiced youth concerns about the institution of the family, and Mikhail Sakharidis of the Coordinating Committee for Greek Orthodox Families. Participating organizations included Agia Emelea Protection for the Unborn Children, Sveva Greek Orthodox Youth, and the journal Parakatathiki, and numerous monasteries from northern Greece. The resolution, who calls on the church administration not to honor at ecclesiastical events politicians who voted for the same-sex marriage law or who participate in pride parades. So it's good to see some resistance among the Greeks, among the true Romans against the fag nonsense going on in Greece that their Supreme Court upheld, which is a very shameful thing to see. It's one thing to have the president and the politicians push this forward. It's another thing to have the courts totally compromised and concede on it. So with all of that, it's been quite the show, quite a lot of analysis all across the board here. Again, I hope everyone is staying vigilant and staying in prayer. Keep us in your prayers. I hope everyone has been enjoying the fast and participating in the church services and whatnot. But with all of that, Dmitry, any final words, feel free to let us know before we land the plane here.
Yeah, just, of course, our dear listeners, thank you for the support. We have some great episodes of Aether Hour and World War Now coming up for you in the future, live streams as well, all kinds of great content, articles that will be published very, very soon. So be aware if you prefer reading rather than listening, there will be some material available for you on worldwarnow.co. And I just wanted to say, beyond, of course, keeping myself and Conrad in your prayers, do also keep in your prayers a new member of, let's just say, the Orthodox Christian Church, born very recently, Gregory, the son of Gabriel the Russian. So Gregory the Russian was born this week to of course, the patriot, the descendant of the Romanov emperors, and, essentially a future member of the Russian right wing, dare I say, an heir to a great family tradition. So Gabriel the Russian had his first son born, and that's, I think, amazing news that, he's, of course, increasing and improving the Russian birthright and heritage. That, again, more Russian children and from Russian Orthodox families is, again, a great sign, especially from a family such as his. And I would just say also keep Igor Strelkov in your prayers as well. He recently tried to appeal his decision to be released on home arrest after almost 3 years of being behind bars in prison, and the Russian court has denied him, so he's still now in prison somewhere near Kirov city on the Ural Mountains. Another Orthodox Christian right-wing patriot whose analysis we, of course, hold very close is still, I think, unjustly imprisoned. So keep all of these people in your prayers. But yeah, some really good news this week, Conrad. Thank you for your analysis.
No, thank you for joining me. I want to thank everyone for making it to the end of the episode. Again, if you like these shows, if you want to keep these weekly analyses free, please support us at worldwarnow.co. You'll get access to the full versions of all of our 125 plus Ether Hour episodes, including all of our frontline reports with Andrei Afanasyev, war correspondent, regularly goes to the Donbass, who took me to the Donbass when I went. You get access to all of my interviews with the Alexander Nevsky Brigade in the Donbass on the front lines, Bishop and Metropolitan Mitrofan of Gorlovka, all of the people I spoke to on my trip to the Donbass, as well as our interviews with Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson, former member of the European Parliament, Nick Griffin, Father Peter Heers, former Defense Minister of Lebanon, Yaqub Saraf, which was our recent episode. So if you want a real deep dive from a expert, someone on the ground in Lebanon, fully witnessing everything on the Memorandum of Understanding and on the fake ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, be sure to check that out. It is linked down below. One of our favorite guests to talk to, and really, in my opinion, the best analysis on the internet when it comes to Middle Eastern Levantine affairs, especially if you're Orthodox, because Mr. Saraf, our good friend now, is a devout Orthodox Christian, probably on his way to Mount Athos very soon as you are listening to this. So thank you all so much for listening. Visit worldwarnow.co to support us. Please like this episode, whether you're listening on Substack, YouTube, X, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Please give us a like. Of course, all of those places you can find us. Rate us 5 stars on those podcast platforms if you have not already. And if you're listening on a different platform, go ahead and subscribe to us on those other platforms as well. It's one of the best ways to help the show grow. I am live every Tuesday evening at 7:45 p.m. Central, 8:45 p.m. Eastern on my show World War Live on the YouTube channel, on the Substack, and on the X accounts. You can also follow us on X at World War Now _. Again, you can find us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can find us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. That's our 24/7 news feed, so go subscribe to us on there. We have our Discord server linked down below, so be sure to check out our Discord server. Also subscribe to the World War Now Clips YouTube channel by searching WWN Clips. You'll find that. Also WWN Clips on X. We post a lot of clips there. Also subscribe to it. Follow us on Instagram. I always forget to shout out the Instagram. Please do that at World War Now _ on Instagram. Also be sure to subscribe, or rather go to antelopehillpublishing.com and use code WWN for 10% off. That's right. You can order any of their books, any of their products. They have their incredible American Patriot Hezbollah patches. They have Culture of Critique by Kevin MacDonald, all sorts of other incredible works and translations. So check out antelopehillpublishing.com and hit us with code World War Now. Use code WWN for 10% off all of your orders. So with all of that, thank you again all so much for listening, making it to the very end. Check us out at worldwarnow.co to support the show. Click the latest Ether Hour that we have linked down below to listen to our interview with Yaqub Saraf. With all of that, we will see you on the next one. God bless.